Thank you very much, and the committee will come to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on two bills to address Puerto Rico's future political status. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. However, for today's hearing, we will allow main sponsors to make a statement in support of the legislation before we turn to the rest of the witnesses. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, the chair will also declare a recess, subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, so ordered. The following, as described in the notice, the statements, documents, or motions may be submitted to the electronic repository hnrc.@mail.house.gov. Without objection, the following members from New York, Representative Torres and Ocasio-Cortez, who are authorized to question the witnesses at today's hearing after permanent members of this committee have their opportunity first. Additionally, please note that as within in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones, and as with our in-person meetings, members may be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Now, let me recognize myself for opening remarks. In the hopes of some brevity, let me just state that I want to thank my colleagues for taking the time to join us at the full committee hearing to discuss the legislation to resolve Puerto Rico's political status. And thank you to our witnesses today for their participation and the time commitment they've made to this hearing. The U.S.-Puerto Rico political relation has been the subject of past discussions in this committee. However, recent events reinforce our responsibility to re-examine the island's territory status. Two pieces of legislation have been introduced this Congress to resolve Puerto Rico's political status. H.R. 2070, Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act of 2021 by Representative Velasquez, and H.R. 1522, Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act by Representative Darren Soto. Each piece of legislation proposes a different process to end the island's current territory status. Puerto Rico's options for non-territory status are statehood, independence, and free association. At the same time, there is existing legislation to address this issue. In 2014, Congress appropriated $2.5 million to be provided to Puerto Rico State Elections Commission for voter education and to conduct a plebiscite by which Puerto Rican voters would determine the future political status of Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Department of Justice is responsible for overseeing and administering that plebiscite. Despite the different views of our witnesses today, I hope we can all agree that Congress has a responsibility to play a constructive role in the resolution of Puerto Rico's political status. We must work effectively together with the executive branch and the island's elected officials through this process while respecting the will of the residents of Puerto Rico. This committee will continue to work with the Biden administration on this important matter and expanding access to federal programs for residents of Puerto Rico and other U.S. territories. The White House already demonstrated willingness to expand such programs as child tax credit, the earned income tax credit in these jurisdictions. I will continue advocating for equity and federal assistance under the Supplemental Security Income and Medicaid. A study released by the administration recently, related to the American Jobs Plan, spoke to the need for action in Puerto Rico. For decades, infrastructure in Puerto Rico has suffered from a systemic lack of investment. The need for action is clear. Puerto Rico's infrastructure received a D- grade in this report on its infrastructure report card. The American Jobs Plan will make a historic investment in our nation's infrastructure and in the needs that are very pronounced in Puerto Rico. And this report released by the administration, I think, further, I think the grade was a D minus in terms of infrastructure. This rating, I think, further presses the effort we need to undertake to address the historic need and inequity related to Puerto Rico and its residents in terms of the support American citizens in Puerto Rico deserve and merit and have earned in terms of equity from the federal government. Now, I also want to, as I said, welcome our witnesses, most of which were suggested by the bill sponsors. And thank you for joining us. It is my hope that we will receive constructive feedback that will direct, inspire the federal government to act and continue today's discussion, which is a priority for the people of Puerto Rico. At this point, let me yield to the ranking member for their comments, and the floor is yours. And I believe that Commissioner Gonzalez Colon, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I would like to offer my deepest condolences on the recent passing of Alex Lofgren from your staff. My sympathies are with you and your office and Alex loved ones. First of all, I want to thank you for calling on this important hearing that addressed the results of the November election in favor of statehood for Puerto Rico. Today, we will hear the testimony on two House bills, H.R. 1522, the Puerto Rico Statehood and Admission Act, and H.R. 2070. H.R. 1522, introduced by Mr. Darren Soto of Florida and myself, representing the island of Puerto Rico, elected to do so in Congress, will end Puerto Rico's centennial territorial status, while the other bill is another tactic to delay the descolonization process and thus perpetuate the unequal treatment of the 3.2 million Americans that lives on the island. Let me be clear, there's nothing that is in this other bill or this other legislation that will offer Puerto Rico that has not been already discussed in 123 years. It's nothing new. Status convention, as proposed by that bill, creates a cumbersome process without any kind of timeline to completion, and which problematically does not recognize that the only two non-territorial and constitutional status options are statehood and independence. Not only that, the bill shamelessly ignores the will of the voters in Puerto Rico, ignores a legitimate democratic process, and ignores self-determination despite the bill's misleading title. Letting the losing minority deny the clear choice of the majority in a free and fair vote isn't democracy. And the United States must not take part in such as a egregious act. That bill is truly a slap in the face to all Puerto Rican voters. On the other hand, H.R. 1522 respects and upholds Puerto Rico's vote for statehood with the true and only self-determination method, and that is the ballot box. Puerto Ricans have voted for statehood 3 times in elections that courts upheld, 2012, 2017, and again in 2020. On March 24 of this year, the certified results of the Puerto Rico State Elections Commission on voter participation showcases that voter turnout was 73.15%, and that is a higher voter turnout than we have seen here in the United States in decades. The bipartisan bill, and I must say thank you to all Republicans and Democratic members that are co-sponsoring Darren Soto's and the People of Puerto Rico bill, which is 1522, will constitute Congress' response to our fellow citizens on the island and provide a formal offer of statehood. The legislation outlines a clear process to enable the island's admission into the Union, should it be ratified by Puerto Rico voters in a federally sponsored yes or no referendum. This is the exact same procedure that was established for Alaska and Hawaii prior to their admission as states. Statehood, I know is going to happen, and is the logical step in our political future as Americans. Congress has the chance to make clear that when American citizens ask for equality and justice, they will get equality and justice as American citizens, not what will welcome proposal to make them separate but equal, like the other bills pretend. The status quo is unsustainable, and until it is addressed, Puerto Rico's economy and social development will continue to lag behind of the 50 states, driving many Puerto Ricans to leave the island in search of better opportunities. An example of that is that today, as we speak, 44% of the island residents lives under the poverty level line. For 140 years, people of Puerto Rico have been proud American citizens, with over 235,000 having honorably served our nation in the U.S. Armed Forces, all while being denied equal participation in the federal decision-making process. Only statehoods provide that equal participation, guarantee U.S. citizenship, and represents a permanent and constitutional solution for Puerto Rico's status issue. And that's the reason I'm proud to join Mr. Darren Soto of Florida, and we together are listening to the voters on the island, to the majority, to the will of the people of Puerto Rico. I'm the one elected to represent them, and I'm doing so by filing this bill. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and let me extend my appreciation for her comments regarding Mr. Loughran, and your comments will extend to our staff. Appreciate it very much. Let me now turn, the chair now recognizes the full committee ranking minority member, Mr. Westerman, for any statement that he may make. Sir? Mr. Westerman, you're recognized. Is Mr. Westerman on?
Mr. Westerman is getting connected, I think, right now.
Okay. Mr. Westerman, you're recognized. Why isn't it? Do the same with that. They're the same.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'm connected now.
Westerman, you're recognized, sir. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your patience. And I want to also thank the witnesses for being with us today. And again, with all the technical issues that we have with these virtual hearings, and given that most of us are now vaccinated, I sincerely hope that we can return to work in person soon. At the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States acquired Puerto Rico along with several other islands. It wasn't until 1917 that Congress, through the Jones Act, extended U.S. citizenship to those residing in Puerto Rico. In 1950, Puerto Rico gained authority over its internal governance, and in 1952, its constitution was ratified by the United States. After approval of the Puerto Rico Constitution, the island formally became known as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. At the time, this was another major step for Puerto Rico, but it did not resolve the relationship ambiguity with the United States, as some held that the Commonwealth provided Puerto Rico a status that was beyond territory, but less than a state. Recent Supreme Court decisions and enactment of PROMESA resulted in the legal determination that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Puerto Rico has tried to gain consensus from its people on how to proceed on the status issue. On November 3rd, 2020, Puerto Rico held its sixth non-binding status referendum that asked voters in the territory one simple question: should Puerto Rico be immediately admitted as a U.S. state? The results of that vote were 52% over 655,000 people voting in favor of statehood and 47% voting against it. Today, we have two bills on the agenda. The first, H.R. 1522, attempts to build upon the November 2020 election. If enacted, the Puerto Rico voters would need to ratify being admitted to the Union. If a majority of Puerto Ricans vote no, nothing would happen, and the bill would cease to be effective. The other bill before us today, H.R. 2070, seeks to establish a status convention, which would include Puerto Rican elected delegates who would define status options for Puerto Ricans to vote on. The status option chosen by voters would require ratification by Congress. While I believe the sponsor is well intentioned to help Puerto Ricans, it is unclear why electing delegates to lifetime terms to define what status options are available is necessary or accomplishes anything. Additionally, the delegates would have to put forward status options for the people of Puerto Rico to vote on. However, the bill does not specify how and if those choices will be narrowed before selection, or if to be voted on or unanimous. In fact, the status convention could be stymied by the same internal disagreement that is playing out between the current Puerto Rican political parties. If the election for the delegates are lopsided for one particular party, the other parties may disengage and eventually boycott the referendum, as has happened in the past. I believe that it is undemocratic that delegates elected under this provision could receive a lifetime appointment, which could result in an endless cycle of debate. Lastly, this bill raises significant concerns, as the bill sponsor's intent is for the convention to consider statehood, independence, free association, or, quote, any option other than the current territorial agreement, end quote. However, there are no other options outside of statehood, independence, or free association. If another option beyond these were selected, Congress would be in a position to potentially bring forward a status option that isn't obtainable under the Constitution. While I have reservations about this bill, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and continuing to engage in meaningful dialogue so Congress can make informed decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman, the ranking member yields, and the chair now recognizes a sponsor of the legislation. Ms. Velasquez, you are recognized. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, for holding this very important hearing today. The topic at hand, the political status of Puerto Rico, is among the most serious and consequential matters the committee will consider. Over 100 years ago, the United States invaded Puerto Rico. Despite the fact that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, and certain advances like the adoption of Puerto Rico's own constitution, the reality is that Puerto Rico remains at the mercy of the federal government. While we may not agree on the outcome, there is widespread agreement that the present political status should change. Let me stress that any such process needs to be fair, inclusive, and democratic. That is the true nature of self-determination. Some have tried to blur self-determination for Puerto Rico with an admission process for the island as the 51st state. This is not only overly simplistic, but it is also wrong. The conversation should not be about a process, should be about a process that respects the will of the people and not how to stack the deck towards a particular status option, much less using millions of dollars in public funds to skew the outcome. This is not the same conversation as the push for DC statehood. The history of the District of Columbia and the colonization of Puerto Rico are two very different realities, and we must consider that in this discussion. So now, Congress must take responsibility and enter into a serious dialogue with the Puerto Rican people. I am very grateful for this hearing and to hear the many perspectives of our distinguished witnesses. So much of the conversation about Puerto Rico's status is understandably focused on the outcome, but that statehood, independence, free association, or any other political arrangement. But I would like to take a second to discuss the importance of a transparent and inclusive democratic process. As such, I am proud that my bill, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, establishes a fair and inclusive process by giving the Puerto Rican people the opportunity to make their voices heard in 2 open elections. This bill recommends Puerto Rico's legislature the creation of a status convention whose delegates will be elected by Puerto Rican voters to develop a long-term solution for Puerto Rico's status. But most importantly, it will be drafted and ratified by and for Puerto Ricans. Unlike the bill being offered by my colleagues, the Self-Determination Act does not impose one option on the people of Puerto Rico. Instead, it allows for a thorough discussion about the implications of each of the status options and what transitional plans would look like. Puerto Ricans have never had the benefit of having any of this information upfront. Congress should commit itself to following through on the self-determination process that Puerto Rican people may embark on. I am grateful that the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act is being co-led by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and has 17 additional House co-sponsors and counting. This bill is also being led in the Senate by Senators Bob Menendez and Republican Senator Roger Wicker, along with their distinguished colleagues, Senator Sanders, Brown, Booker, Gillibrand, Warren, and Markey. This is a historic opportunity for the people of Puerto Rico, a moment to finally chart their own course. I'm leading the chart on this bill so that we can once and for all address the question of Puerto Rico's political status in a manner that truly respects their will and aspirations. So I look forward to today's hearing, and I once again thank the chairman and the ranking member. Now is the time to act, and this is a step towards meaningful progress. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and thank you. And let me, before I introduce our witnesses, just a commentary on the side. Sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Darren Soto. In an effort, Mr. Soto, and I will extend a courtesy when your time comes up in terms of questioning the witnesses or making a statement, extend the courtesy of some additional time. Insofar as a sponsor, we try to keep a balance as to both pieces of legislation, try to retain that. And I didn't recognize you as a sponsor of the legislation for that. Hopefully I will extend a courtesy when your opportunity comes up. And thank you very much for your cooperation and making sure that we retain the balance of members speaking to both pieces of legislation. Let me now remind, before I will introduce the witnesses. Before I do that, let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses join remotely to using stage view so they can pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning begins from the members. The chair notes that Senator Maria de Lourdes Santiago is participating with the with the assistance of an interpreter to ensure that members here, to ensure that the members hear from the witnesses. I will allow some extra time for opening statements so that she can hear the translation. This practice is under the chair's recognition, as described in Committee 4A. I will also note that the chair encourages members that under the that members are encouraged to ask all questions in English to avoid any that are directed to the senator, so that we can avoid any complications in terms of the translation that'll be required. With that, let me now turn to our first witness, the Honorable Pedro Pelagosi, Governor of Puerto Rico. We appreciate you very much, your attendance, Governor, and the floor is yours, and thank you for your attendance. Appreciate it. Sir? Governor?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Gonzalez Colon, and members of the committee. For years, Congress has entertained the idea of putting an end to the unresolved issue of Puerto Rico's political status, but has failed. Some reasons, or excuses, if you will, have included that Congress should not interfere, that no option had a majority, or that Puerto Ricans needed consensus. And many members of Congress have preferred to take no position on the future of Puerto Rico's status, hiding behind their support for self-determination. Things are different now. On November 3rd of last year, the residents of Puerto Rico voted to resolve their status. The process was straightforward: an up or down, yes or no vote on statehood. It was a referendum, much like many other territories had prior to becoming states. And the majority of the voters in Puerto Rico said yes to statehood. More Puerto Ricans voted for statehood than for any candidate running in that same election. So today here we are again to discuss Puerto Rico's political future. I contend that we should only be discussing how to enable the freely and democratically expressed will of the American citizens of Puerto Rico. They deserve an answer to their request for statehood. That is precisely what the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act does. As a self-executing legislation, the bill sets out the terms and conditions by which Puerto Rico could be admitted as a state, and presents a formal offer of statehood to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, who in turn are given the opportunity to accept or reject the admission in a final referendum. If the majority votes again in favor of equality, Puerto Rico will begin a transition to statehood. Let me be clear. This bill does not force or impose statehood on Puerto Rico. It only offers statehood and provides a proven mechanism and the legal means for it to happen. When statehood is granted, the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico will have equal rights, equal responsibilities, and full representation in the U.S. Congress, and will be treated equally under all federal laws, policies, and programs. Puerto Rico will also be able to participate in U.S. presidential elections to select the leaders that implement the laws that they live under. Perhaps most importantly, for the very first time, the world's greatest democracy will offer equality to the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, who have been unequal to their fellow Americans for well over a century. Unfortunately, we are also here today to discuss another bill which offers a convoluted process to deal with unknown status options or status options that Puerto Rico's voters have already rejected. Those who did not like the people's choice in the November plebiscites, many who for years had dared proponents of statehood to carry out an up or down vote on statehood, now choose to ignore the results, change the process, and change the questions. Anything to avoid accepting the will of the people. H.R. 2070, ironically called the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, is the farthest thing from self-determination. It is the epitome of colonialism. It not only ignores the people's vote, but it also aims to tell Puerto Ricans what the process to express their will should be. That is not self-determination. that is an imposed determination. If you claim to favor self-determination, then you must support what Puerto Rico's voters freely determined. And that means admitting Puerto Rico as a state. You must take a stand on their choice. In the late 1860s, members of Congress, just like you, against great opposition, stood on the right side of history and granted all men the right to vote, including African Americans. In the early 1920s, members of Congress, just like you, stood on the right side of history and granted women the right to vote. In 1964, members of Congress, just like you, stood on the right side of history and voted to prohibit discrimination and segregation. Our nation still has much to do to become a more perfect union and to live up to the democratic ideals that are based on equality for all. Now, the question I pose to you is, on which side of history will you stand? Will the position of this committee and of this Congress be that American citizens who want full equality should be denied it? Will you tell the thousands of soldiers and veterans from Puerto Rico who have fought and died for those democratic ideals that they have not earned their right to be equal under the U.S. Constitution? That they must defend this country in war, but cannot enjoy its democracy at home? Are you okay with telling their spouses, their children, and their widows and widowers that they do not deserve to vote for the president that sent them in harm's way? This is not about whether you support self-determination. This is about whether, as members of Congress, you are willing to stand on the side of equality and respect the results of our vote. My people and I will never consent to inequality. Inequality is un-American, and we must all stand against it. That is why I stand in front of you today to speak for the American citizens of Puerto Rico who spoke with their vote. We deserve equality as American citizens, and we will not stop this fight until we achieve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Governor. Let me now, the chair now recognizes Ms. Joanne Velez Garcia, Vice President for Puerto Rico Democratic Party. Ms. Velez Garcia, the time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner, and distinguished members. I have devoted my life to advocacy for equality for more than 25 years, primarily women's and LGBTQ rights. After going to New York to marry, my wife and I joined others in a federal suit to end Puerto Rico's discriminatory same-sex marriage ban. In 2017, I was appointed president of the first Governor's Advisory Council on LGBTQ affairs in the territory and first elected Democratic Party vice chair. Puerto Rico's unequal status, denying equality to more than 3.2 million Americans, is the biggest contradiction to the U.S. status as a democracy. Testifying in this first panel before you today are 4 American citizens, of which 2 are your equals and 2 are not. The governor of Puerto Rico and myself, like our fellow Puerto Rican residents in the island, are second-class citizens since we do not live in a state, whereas the other 2 panelists who live in the mainland have their full-fledged U.S. citizen rights. The shameful colonial status under which the residents of the island are not recognized as equals must end. H.R. 1522 by Representative Soto would honor the majority self-determination choice of Puerto Ricans for equality within the nation. It follows free and fair votes in 2012 and 2017 on all of the possible options that chose statehood. Because boycotts urged by the opponents who knew they would lose diminished the number of votes, our elected representatives called a simple vote in 2020 on statehood, as had been held in other territories. The various opponents thought that together they could win and staged a big campaign. Virtually as many people voted as voted for any local office. a greater percentage than in the statehood votes of many territories, and statehood won by an unequivocal margin. Now, minority opponents want you to ignore the purest possible form of self-determination, a democratic choice
We're good.
determined
Good.
in a process determined by elected representatives. H.R. 2070 tries to pressure the territory into conducting a process that our elected government has declined to adopt and has no purpose other than a desperate attempt to embarrass the U.S. into accepting a status proposal that successive congressional committees and administrations of both national parties have said is impossible for constitutional and other reasons. Accepting the results of an election in 2020 was a national issue. Democrats, and I trust most Republicans, accept fair votes. The 2016 PROMESA law, which originated in this committee, recognized, and I quote, Puerto Rico's right to determine its future political status, end quote, among the possible options by its own method of choice. All should now respect Puerto Rico's self-determination. H.R. 2070 invites status proposals that are not possible under the Constitution and the basic policies of the U.S. The primary authors call this, and I quote, any other non-territorial status, end quote. In addition to statehood and the nationhood options, such Commonwealth status proposals are the exact reason that the issue of Puerto Rico's status has not been resolved and that Puerto Rico remains a colonial territory. H.R. 2070 would authorize certain members of Congress to tell Puerto Ricans what their culture and language should be. It would be outrageous if the entire U.S. government tried. It couldn't constitutionally in a state or practically in a nation. H.R. 2070 absurdly proposes to force the full Congress to vote on changes in a wide range of federal laws proposed by Puerto Rico without consideration by committees of jurisdiction or amendment and only minimal debate. This alone should be enough to show it for what it is, a ruse to prevent democracy, equality, and self-determination for Puerto Ricans. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Jose Fuentes, Chair, Puerto Rico Statehood Council. The time is yours.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, and distinguished members of this committee. I am honored to appear before you as former Attorney General of Puerto Rico and Chairman of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council. I speak today in support of the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act, which proposes a constitutionally sound process respecting the will of the majority of voters in Puerto Rico. I last testified in Congress on this issue 23 years ago after this House passed bipartisan legislation sponsored by Congressman Dunn Young to hold a plebiscite in Puerto Rico, offering voters the only options available to them under the U.S. Constitution. That is statehood, independence with free association, or remaining a U.S. territory. Speaker Newt Gingrich led House consideration of the bill, which died in the Senate, but kicked off over 2 decades of bipartisan progress towards a more complete American democracy through Puerto Rican statehood. After the U.S. Senate failed to act on the Young bill, in December of 1998, Puerto Rico held a plebiscite presenting all the constitutionally viable alternatives. The Puerto Rican electorate rejected the current territorial status and all the constitutional options. That prompted President Bill Clinton to establish the President's Task Force on Puerto Rico Status to clarify both the status options available to Puerto Rico and the process to realize these options. President George W. Bush continued this initiative, consulted extensively with stakeholders, and in December 2005, the task force published a report outlining a process to resolve Puerto Rico's ultimate status. It was the most complete analysis of the status issue under any president. Its findings remain relevant today, calling for a two-step self-determination process authorized by Congress. First, Puerto Rico's voters would be asked whether they wish to remain a territory. If voters elected to remain a territory, then they should be asked the same question periodically to ensure continued consent of the governed, something we clearly do not have today. However, if voters opted to change, the report called for another plebiscite to choose between the only permanent non-territorial options: statehood, independence, or free association. These options are the only viable alternatives to territory status under the U.S. Constitution, period. Full stop. There is nothing else. This has been confirmed by the Supreme Court, Department of Justice, this Congress, and every White House since Ronald Reagan, a staunch supporter of statehood for Puerto Rico. So what's the use of a status convention? There is nothing new under the U.S. Constitution. In 2010, under the leadership of then resident Commissioner Pedro, this House again passed a bill to implement the 2005 President Bush Task Force report recommendations. The U.S. Senate again failed to act, but Republican Governor Luis Fortuño signed legislation approving the two-part plebiscite in 2012 with 78% participation. 54% of voters rejected continuing under the current territorial relationship, and 61% voted for statehood. In 2017, Puerto Rico held another plebiscite under local law, this time between territory, statehood, and independence in its two forms. But when polls showed statehood leading, opponents boycotted. So even though statehood received 97% support, turnout was not high. To remove any remaining doubts, in 2020, Puerto Rico legislated a simple statehood yes or no vote, just as Alaska and Hawaii did 70 years ago. With 73% of effective voters participating, statehood won by a clear majority of 52.5% and garnered more votes than any candidate on the ballot, clearly cutting across local party lines. Yet, here we are today. After 123 years under U.S. rule, 6 commissions, 3 presidential task force reports, 65 hearings, over 100 failed bills, and 18 definitions of Commonwealth with no change, H.R. 2070 would cause further delay, disempower voters, and put future status in the hands of local political party elites by imposing a federal mandate for a local status convention to recycle impossible options. The people know what the options are, and statehood has won in 3 separate plebiscites. Puerto Rico has self-determined. You should pass H.R. 1522 as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fuentes. And now let me recognize Dr. Cristina D. Ponsa Kraus, Professor of Law, Columbia Law School. Doctor, the time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the committee. I'm a law professor at Columbia University and an expert on Puerto Rico's constitutional status. And I'm the author of a letter to congressional leadership signed by 47 legal and constitutional scholars supporting the Admission Act and opposing the Self-Determination Act. The letter has been introduced into the record. I'm also Puerto Rican myself. I was raised on the island from my infancy until I graduated from high school. I'm a native speaker of Spanish. My parents and extended family live in Puerto Rico. I appreciate the committee's attention to the urgent matter of Puerto Rico's future and the invitation to speak today. Puerto Ricans reject territorial status, which denies them a guarantee of local self-government and federal representation. Last November, a majority chose statehood in a referendum on the island. The Admission Act responds to that vote, and it is crucial to be clear about how. It does not automatically admit the island into statehood. It does not impose or force or grant statehood to Puerto Rico. Instead, it offers statehood to Puerto Rico. But first, Puerto Ricans must vote in a second referendum in which they can accept or reject the offer. Only if they accept does the act provide for Puerto Rico's admission into statehood. This is a careful and constitutionally sound process. The contrast with the Self-Determination Act could not be more stark. This act contradicts its own title by completely ignoring the referendum. In a thinly veiled attempt to delay and therefore defeat an offer of statehood, it sends Puerto Ricans back to the drawing board to have a debate they've been having for 70 years. And it requires Congress to ratify whatever option they choose, something Congress cannot constitutionally bind itself to do. The act requires convention delegates to, quote, debate and draft definitions on self-determination options outside the territorial clause. If this language means Puerto Ricans should debate the pros and cons of statehood and independence, it is gratuitous and dilatory. Puerto Ricans do not need a congressional invitation to debate these options, and they can keep right on debating them even after Congress offers statehood. If this language means what its principal sponsors have said it means, then the problem gets worse. They have explained that a convention would consider, quote, statehood, independence, free association, or any option other than the current territorial arrangement. This gets wrong a basic point of constitutional law. There are no other options. Statehood is non-territorial. Independence is non-territorial. Free association has been described as a third option, but to be clear, it is a form of independence with a treaty or compact of free association between two sovereign nations. In short, there are two and only two non-territorial options for Puerto Rico: statehood and independence with or without free association. By inviting Puerto Ricans to define other territorial options, this bill revives a debate Puerto Ricans have already had. When the island became a Commonwealth in 1952, many Puerto Ricans believed it had ceased to be a U.S. territory, become a separate sovereign, and entered into a binding compact with the United States. If there were a compact, Congress would no longer have the power to modify Puerto Rico's government unilaterally, and the island would at least no longer be a territory. But they were wrong. As the Supreme Court recently confirmed, even as a Commonwealth, Puerto Rico remains a U.S. territory, and Congress retains the power to modify the island's government unilaterally, as it did, for example, when it created the Financial Oversight and Management Board in 2016. The myth of non-territorial Commonwealth has long prevented Puerto Ricans from reckoning with the constitutional reality that the only alternatives to being a territory are statehood and independence. The last thing Puerto Ricans need is to debate options that are no longer debatable. The Self-Determination Act invites Puerto Ricans to have a debate they've been having for 7 decades and for which they need no congressional invitation. Yet it deprives them of an offer of statehood, which they have never had. They just asked for, and only Congress can deliver. Congress should pass the Admission Act without delay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the Speaker of the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, the Honorable Rafael Hernandez. Sir, time is yours. Mr. Hernandez, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member, President Commissioner Gonzalez Colon, and distinguished members of the committee. I am the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Puerto Rico. I stand here today representing the people of Puerto Rico. I fully endorse H.R. 2070, introduced by Chairwoman Nydia Velasquez and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is Senate companion bill introduced by Chairman Bob Menendez. This bicameral and bipartisan legislation is long overdue. It will empower Puerto Ricans with an inclusive, transparent, and democratic process to determine our own political future and relationship with the United States. On the H.R. 2070, a political statute convention will be created and delegated will be elected to discuss options with federal in Congress and the Federal Department of Justice, and therefore create an official, legitimate, and comprehensive bilateral conversation on status. On Elected Day 2020, the people of Puerto Rico undeniably forged an historical diverse legislature with representation of 5 local political parties. I am both humbled and honored to have been elected by multiple sides of the aisle. This reality trusts me with the responsibility of defending a fair and inclusive self-determination process. Puerto Rico treasures their identity and the benefits of their American citizenship. Trade, currency, defense, and common citizenship are assets that we enjoy today as such are non-negotiable. A vast majority, some 85% of Puerto Ricans, greatly value their citizenship and favor a permanent relationship with the United States. On March 2nd, with votes from members who support statehood, free association, independence, and Commonwealth, we approve concurrent House Resolution number 1 to demand that Congress clearly and affirmatively establish the alternative it is willing to consider a solution to the political relationship. It is also request that Congress promote a binding, inclusive process with all ideological sectors. I support H.R. 2070 because voters will be given a realistic definition of each viable option, avoiding political grandstanding. It is time we build a relationship based on dignity and respect. The Puerto Rico Determination Act ensures a fair process that provides certainty to our people and to their political aspirations. International law recognizes a fourth alternative. It is for perspective, as H.R. 2070 reaffirmed, the Estado Libre Asociado has the legal and practical viability to developing in political model that our people can freely choose. I firmly believe it is the interest of Puerto Rico and the United States to promote this process. Previous non-binding exclusionary electoral events managed by partisan extremists have wasted both our time and limited resources. Puerto Rico deserves a legitimate and truly binding self-determination process to ensure unity in the eyes of our people. This standard can only be achieved with equal participation. Democracies evolve. That is why we legislate. The U.S. has just changed history. Just think it was over 100 years ago that women were given the right to vote. I sit today before your committee to testify in support of legislation led by women that will enable our government to evolve the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. I urge this committee to approve H.R. 2070. I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And let me now recognize the Honorable Aníbal Acevedo Villa, former governor, former colleague of mine on this committee, the Popular Democratic Party governor. The time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I think I know what is the question in the mind of many of you today. Should Puerto Rico become a state? Let me be clear. I strongly oppose statehood. Like many in Puerto Rico and many members of Congress, we recognize that statehood is not good for Puerto Rico, nor will it be good for the United States. Our opposition is based on historical, cultural, national identity, and economic realities. But let's examine today a more immediate question. Is there a mandate to grant statehood to Puerto Rico? The answer is no. Yes, the people of Puerto Rico voted with a close margin in favor of statehood in November. That was a non-binding referendum rejected by the U.S. Department of Justice and by 4 of the 5 political parties in Puerto Rico. On election day, Puerto Ricans elected a new anti-statehood majorities in the House and the Senate, and most of the mayors elected that day are also anti-statehood. The truth, we remain deeply divided. Any attempt to move forward a petition to make Puerto Rico a state will further divide our people without solving the underlying problem of our colonial relationship. In my written statement, I have shared some data from a poll conducted by the firm Hart Research in August of last year. When all the options are given to the people of Puerto Rico, statehood support goes down to 41%. Commonwealth gets 38%, free association 8%, and independence 6%. Making Puerto Rico a state is an irrevocable decision that will affect present and future generations. The most important information that comes from the Hart Research is the limited support that statehood has with the younger generation. Within the 18 to 34-year-old bracket, the support for statehood goes down to 35%, and the support for free association goes up to 20%, and for independence to 15%. Contrary to all other status bills introduced during the last 30 years, H.R. 2070, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, was not drafted nor pushed by any of the local political parties in Puerto Rico. That's a good way to start this contentious process. For the first time, this bill gives the opportunity for Congress to talk directly to the people of Puerto Rico. H.R. 2070 is not a colonial imposition. It doesn't order anything, nor precludes any types of outcome. No one is excluded nor favored. If our legislature decides to call for a status convention, all status options will have a fair opportunity to participate and elect delegates. Actually, if the statehood in reality are the majority of the delegates elected to the convention will support that option. The most important component of this bill is the creation of a Congressional Negotiating Commission. This commission will have to answer and clarify many of the legal, constitutional, language, cultural, and economic questions that for more than 100 years our people have attempted to answer, but Congress has failed to address. Included now, how will the different status alternatives be affected or impacted by the ongoing process established by PROMESA and the restructuring of the debt? Everything will then be in the hand of Puerto Rico. On the H.R. 2070, the people will freely vote 2 times, initially to elect the members of the convention and later to select the preferred status option. The only limitation is that any definition presented to the people for a vote after the negotiation with the commission must be outside of the territorial clause. That will guarantee that we really put Puerto Rico on the path for decolonization. The first time I testified before this committee on this issue was in 1997. All congressional attempts have failed precisely because they had no consensus in Puerto Rico and were based on the agenda of the Puerto Rico Statehood Party to tilt the process in their favor. Before us today, you have 2 paths. One that will repeat the same mistakes of the last 30 years, or you can finally try a different approach, inclusive and unbiased toward any alternative. The Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act is a creative and fair process to avoid the mistakes of the past. The path toward decolonization is not going to be easy, but it has to start now. I urge this committee to approve H.R. 2070.
Thank you, sir. Let me now introduce the Honorable Maria de Lourdes Santiago, Senator, Puerto Rico Independence Party. Senator, the time is yours.
Señor presidente y demás integrantes del comité. Ante todo, me parece esencial poner esta vista en su justo contexto. Si hoy estamos aquí, es debido a la negativa de los Estados Unidos de asumir su responsabilidad sobre Puerto Rico, el territorio que reclamaron como botín de guerra hace ya 123 años. La persistencia del dominio colonial de los Estados Unidos sobre nuestra nación, a pesar de las innumerables ocasiones y diversos métodos mediante los cuales las puertorriqueñas hemos reclamado el fin del colonialismo, contraviene disposiciones jurídicas y rehúye responsabilidades históricas, resultando en una situación opresiva para nosotros y vergonzosa para ustedes. En el problema del estatus, Puerto Rico ha sido la víctima y los Estados Unidos el victimario. Solo en una ocasión ha iniciado el Congreso un proceso serio dirigido a que Puerto Rico ejerza su derecho a la libre determinación. El proyecto Johnston, en el periodo del 1989 al 1991. Aunque no fue aprobado, dejó enseñanzas fundamentales que no deben ser desoídas por este comité. Primero, la imposibilidad, confirmada en tiempos recientes por las tres ramas del gobierno de los Estados Unidos, de elevar el actual sistema colonial a una auténtica relación bilateral entre pares. Segundo, la necesidad de elaborar un plan de transición hacia la independencia y finalmente, la resistencia a la oferta de estadidad a una nación caribeña y latinoamericana, en la que la inmensa mayoría de sus habitantes, aun los que favorecen la anexión, no se consideran estadounidenses y muchos proponentes de la estadidad exhiben como principal fundamento para su aspiración política su ambición de perpetuar la dependencia económica de las transferencias federales. De los proyectos ante su consideración, solo el 2070 permite evadir el callejón sin salida al que llegó el proyecto Johnston. En contraste con el 1522, el 2070 contiene elementos claves que lo convierten en un instrumento potencialmente efectivo para alcanzar la descolonización, al permitir que a través de la Comisión Congresional de Negociación Bilateral que propone la medida, se conteste la pregunta esencial de qué está realmente dispuesto el Congreso a ofrecer a Puerto Rico. Distinto al caso de Washington, D.C., nuestro país se encuentra en bancarrota como resultado del fracaso de la relación colonial. Tampoco existe en Puerto Rico un apoyo abrumador a la estabilidad, sino que persisten profundas diferencias en cuanto al futuro de nuestra relación con los Estados Unidos. Y más importante aún, la identidad cultural de los residentes de D.C. es claramente estadounidense. Y en ese elemento crítico son indistinguibles de los habitantes de otros estados. Ese no es el caso de Puerto Rico. Nuestra nacionalidad estaba definida y forjada antes de que Estados Unidos invadiera nuestras costas y después de 123 años de coloniaje, la mayoría de la población no tiene dominio efectivo del inglés. El nuestro no es un problema de reivindicación de derechos civiles individuales, es uno del derecho colectivo a la libre determinación de un pueblo colonizado. Además, todos y todas sabemos que el 1522, según declaraciones del liderato senatorial de ambos partidos, está destinado al fracaso, lo que lo convierte en una vía segura hacia, otra vez, la inacción congresional y hacia la continuación del régimen colonial. De fundamental importancia para el éxito del 2070 es que el Congreso insista en el requisito indispensable de que las opciones de estatus estén fuera de la cláusula territorial. El Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño le da la bienvenida al HR 2070 y esperamos contribuir con enmiendas que optimicen su eficacia. Su aprobación representaría para ustedes un regreso a los principios que una vez guiaron a la nación, que fue la primera en enarbolar la bandera de la libertad y la independencia en América. Son mis palabras, señor presidente.
Gracias. Now let me turn the time over to the interpreter.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, At the outset, it is important to put this hearing in its right context. We are here today because of the refusal by the United States to exercise its responsibility towards Puerto Rico, the territory it claimed 123 years ago as a war booty. The continuance of the U.S. colonial domination of our nation, notwithstanding the many occasions and diverse methods by which we have demanded an end to colonialism, contravenes both legal and historical mandates, provoking a situation that is oppressive for us and shameful for the United States. Regarding the status problem, Puerto Rico has been the victim and the United States the perpetrator. The only serious initiative undertaken by Congress to promote the exercise of the right to self-determination by the Puerto Rican people was the consideration between 1898 and 1991 of the Johnston Bill. Though it was defeated, there were three important outcomes that deserve careful examination by this committee. The impossibility, recently ratified by the three government branches of the U.S. government, to upgrade the existing colonial status to a truly bilateral relation amongst equals. The need to elaborate a transition plan for independence. And finally, the resistance to make an offer of statehood to a Caribbean and Latin American nation in which the vast majority of the population, even those who favor annexation, do not think of themselves as Americans. And many of those that promote statehood wield as the main reason for their political aspiration their ambition to perpetuate the financial dependence on federal funds. Of the two bills before this committee, only H.R. 2070 provides the means to avoid a similar dead end as the Johnston Bill. In contrast with H.R. 1522, H.R. 2070 contains the elements that make it a potentially effective instrument to promote decolonization by enabling the Congressional Bilateral Negotiating Committee included in the bill to answer the essential question as to what Congress is really willing to offer Puerto Rico. Contrary to the case of Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico is financially bankrupt as a result of the failure of the colonial relationship. Neither is there an overwhelming support for statehood in Puerto Rico. On the contrary, we are deeply divided as to our future relation with the United States. More importantly, the national identity of the inhabitants of Washington, D.C. is unmistakably American, and in this critical respect, indistinguishable from the residents of other states. That is not the case of Puerto Rico. Our nationality was forged and established before the U.S. invasion. And even after 123 years of colonialism, most of the population does not have a working knowledge of the English language. Ours is not the struggle for full individual civil rights. It is one for the collective right to self-determination of a colonized nation. Furthermore, we are all aware that the leadership of both parties in the U.S. Senate have anticipated that H.R. 1522 is destined to failure, which relates as another path to congressional inaction and to the continuation of the colonialism. Finally, we must emphasize that for H.R. 2070 to be successful, it is critically important that Congress be unyielding in its requirement that the status options be outside the territorial clause. The Puerto Rican Independence Party welcomes H.R. 2070 and looks forward to proposing modifications to the bill in order to improve its efficacy. The enactment of H.R. 2070 would represent a much-needed return to the principles that once guided the nation that first raised the flag for freedom and independence in America.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. And let me now turn to our last witness. Let me recognize the Honorable Manuel Natal, President, Citizens Victory Movement, Mr. Natal, the time is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and members of the committee. My name is Manuel Natal Albelo. I'm a former member of Puerto Rico's House of Representatives, and as of last Sunday, I serve as General Coordinator of Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, a recently created, people-powered, community-oriented, progressive political party in Puerto Rico. I must stress from the outset that Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States since 1898 and legally defined as an unincorporated territory, a possession but not part of the United States, under the plenary powers of Congress. Although Congress has reorganized the territorial government over the years, the colonial nature of the relationship has remained unchanged. Since 1898, Congress has never, let me repeat that again, never consulted the Puerto Rican people in a binding plebiscite or referendum on whether to retain the present status, become independent, or a state of the union. Having retained its plenary powers, Congress should assume its responsibility for a territory it claims as a possession. Yet, it has avoided doing so for 123 years. Today, we have an opportunity to change that. This committee, and eventually Congress, is presented with a unique choice between two paths. The first path is one that we have traveled many times before. Plebiscites or referenda promulgated unilaterally and without consensus by a political party on the island, devoid of informed public deliberation and usually designed to be slanted towards the outcome favored by the ruling party. The final results of which have lacked democratic legitimacy, whether the prevailing option receives 97% of the votes or 0% of the votes. That path of exclusion and subordination is currently represented by HR 1522. The second path is one that, although it has been historically promoted by diverse and well-respected groups in Puerto Rico, it has never been supported by Congress or by any previous administration in Puerto Rico. A binding self-determination process in which all non-colonial, non-territorial options can compete on a level playing field, in which the people of Puerto Rico get to cast an informed vote and Congress must act upon the will of the majority. That path of inclusion and empowerment is currently represented by HR 2070. We chose the latter and urge Congress to do the same. We, a political movement that promotes real change in all aspects of our lives as Puerto Ricans, including ending the colonial relationship. We, the only political movement in Puerto Rico that has elected officials from all three non-colonial, non-territorial options. That is statehood, independence, and some form of free association. How have we managed to achieve what the two-party system in Puerto Rico has not in more than 70 years? By focusing on finding common ground and not on how we can cancel each other's effort on the status question. In this particular case, we have focused on building a fair and inclusive process rather than trying to predetermine the outcome. This is why we propose and support the Constitutional Status Convention, Asamblea Constitucional de Estatus, as the best means for decolonizing Puerto Rico. Puerto Rican, yes, are US citizens, but we're also a nation, a people with our own identity and culture under US colonial rule since 1898. Sometimes these facts generate confusion. Should Puerto Rican aspire to become a state of the union? Should they become independent? Should they become a sovereignly, freely associating state with the United States? A democratic response from the United States Congress should be that is for them, not us to decide. The first step in that process shall be done by ourselves, los puertorriqueños y las puertorriqueñas, in a true binding exercise of self-determination. We are ready to do our part. It's your moral responsibility to fulfill yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me thank the witnesses for their testimony. Thank the panel. And we'll go to questions now. The committee, under Committee Rule 3D, then imposes a 5-minute on the questions by members, with the noted exception that I made regarding the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Soto, who didn't have an opportunity at the beginning to speak to his legislation. The chair reminds members that under the chair's right of recognition, as described in Committee Rule 3, will provide some reasonable additional time for any member that has a question for Senator Maria de Lourdes to account for the interpreter. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish. And on the majority side, that process is going to be by seniority. Minority side is the names that were submitted to us by the minority in that sequence. Let me now, I will forego at this point my initial questioning and turn to and recognize Mr. Costa, and I will alternate back and forth for his 5 minutes. Mr. Costa, the time is yours. Mr. Costa? Let me now recognize, in order of seniority, the next member, Vice Chair of Insular Affairs as well, Mr. Sablan. Sir, time is yours.
Chairman Grijalva, thank you very much. And I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I've learned enough over the years that I will stay out of Puerto Rico's political status issues. I will stay away from this until when I have no choice but to cast the voting committee. I yield back. Thank you.
Let me now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman. The floor is yours. Mr. Westerman, you're recognized. Let me continue and recognize, and we'll go back to Mr. Westerman when he connects with us. Let me now recognize the gentleman, Mr. Heiss, for your time. Sir, you're recognized. As recommended by the minority, let me now recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon for her 5 minutes. You're recognized, madam.
Jennifer, I think you're muted.
Ms. Gonzalez, recognize Gonzalez Colon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to say thank you again to all witnesses that are here with us today. And I want to say thank you to the governor of Puerto Rico for traveling to DC. And my first question is going to be for him. Many people are saying that statehood votes in November last year were not enough, or the percentage was not big enough to establish the vote for the decision of the people of the island. And I just want to point out that 52% of the vote was for statehood, which is an absolute majority, and just 47% against. It's like almost 5% of difference. And if we compare that to the results of the general elections in the United States, where President Biden got elected by 51% versus 46%, I think is less than 4.4%, which is, that means that for some people, elections in the United States were a landslide or a bigger margin, But that margins are not good enough for the people of Puerto Rico to establish their support for statehood. So I think that's something that the governor of Puerto Rico, as the only one elected to pursue the will of the island, and I just need just to say it on the record, the status option of statehood got more votes than any elected official on the island. Governor and I, mayors and state legislators. So that's something that even between party lines on the island, statehood got more votes than anyone else. Governor, do you think the percentage to support statehood and the mandate that you do have, the request of the state, of the government of Puerto Rico to Congress for statehood was made by an official petition last year. Do you support that?
Yes. Thank you, Resident Commissioner. As in any democracy, in Puerto Rico, the majority rules. That's how democracies work across the world. To put this in context, I publicly have been calling for an up or down vote on statehood for years. And the reason was that I realized that the plebiscites we had been conducting, providing multiple options for the public, for the people of Puerto Rico, were causing, we're not working. And let me explain why. Always you had a sector, a faction of Puerto Rico complaining that the options were not inclusive, that we had left out one option or another, that the options were not well defined. Is the never-ending story. The beauty or wisdom of an up or down vote, in this case for statehood, but it could have been for the current territorial status, it could have been for independence, it could have been for free association. The beauty or wisdom of this vote is that it's all inclusive. All those who support statehood could say yes, and all those who oppose statehood for whatever reasons, they support another option or they're not yet ready for Puerto Rico to become a state, could say no. And that's precisely what happened here. Puerto Rico had no offer from Congress. There was no federal legislation providing for this plebiscite. But in accordance with the principle of self-determination, Puerto Rico always has the right to conduct a plebiscite or a referendum like we did. And there was no boycott this time around. And we got an absolute majority against all odds. Even the Justice Department under the Trump administration objected to this vote. And even then, the people requested statehood. So the least that Congress should be doing is responding to this vote, answering to this vote. And your bill, Resident Commissioner, Congressman Soto's bill, is the right approach. Again, does what Hawaii and Alaska did. It basically tells the people of Puerto Rico, this is statehood, these are the terms and conditions. Hold a referendum. If you ratify it, the president will proclaim it. And it provides for a year period for a transition. So I fully support your bill. It is democratic. It is fair because, again, all those for statehood will have the chance to support it, and all those against, for whatever reasons, will be able to say no.
Thank you, Governor. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me recognize Chairman Huffman for your 5 minutes and questions, comments. Sir, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I simply want to say hello to our dear friend and former colleague, Governor Pelagosi. It's great to see you again. Pedro, we miss you at the Natural Resources Committee, and want to thank everyone for this great discussion. It certainly helped.
Thank you.
Helped me prepare for what I hope will be an important and helpful vote in the weeks and months ahead. I yield back.
Mr. Young? Sir?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I thought Mr. Huffman had something to say. I'm up.
You're up, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, and thank you, Governor, and all the witnesses. This is an issue I've been involved in for many, many years. We had the Young bill that did pass the House one time by one vote. I'm proud of that. And of course, I believe in statehood. I believe in Jennifer's bill. I think it's time. As far as plebiscites, we've had 3 of them. Each time, I believe we've actually been victorious in the sense of being a state. It's long overdue. We talk about this all the time, but I'm part of that. Puerto Rico was supposed to be the state after Alaska, even before Alaska. And because of certain things, the delegates were in Congress at that time. We came by, and then, of course, instead of Puerto Rico becoming a state, Hawaii became a state. If anybody there from Hawaii, I apologize, but it was wrong pecking order. Now, I think Puerto Rico has a decision. They've said before, I think we ought to keep going. I like Jennifer's bill. I no disrespect for anybody else has another bill, but let's not take and plow fields that have been plowed before. The people have spoken. Let's have the vote. Let's become a state, a 51st state. And although I have some opposition on my side about they'll all be Democrats, they said the same thing about Alaska. Now we're all Republicans. So everybody has the right to decide what they're going to be, but don't rethink what they're going to be because it doesn't work out that way. Hawaii was supposed to be Republican. So, Mr. Chairman and Jennifer and all the people involved, you've got a person who's going to work very hard with you, try to achieve the goals of what this bill really tries to do. And Governor, you just, very frankly, do you think an HR 2070 ignores the will of the voters of Puerto Rico?
Of course not. Are you referring, Chairman, Congressman Young? Are you referring to HR 1522 or HR 2070?
2070.
2070. The problem with 2070 is the following. It clearly ignores the vote that just happened. And when I hear people talking about that wasn't a fair vote, that it wasn't inclusive, what are they talking about? By definition, by design, it couldn't be fairer. It couldn't be more inclusive because a yes or no vote allows everybody to express themselves. And that's what happened in Puerto Rico. All those now opposing HR 2070, or at least most of them, campaigned against statehood before the plebiscite in Puerto Rico. They had to turn it back. And they can now continue lobbying Congress against it. But they shouldn't be stopping this process from happening because Congress should be responding. Congress should be allowing this process to go forward, not start a whole new process, providing for the election of delegates, a bipartisan or joint commission that it's going to engage in a dialogue with these delegates to talk about options that nobody knows what we're talking about, including non-territorial options other than statehood and independence, which is clearly unconstitutional. That definitely is a never-ending story. It has no deadlines on it. And actually, it has constitutional problems because it is only Congress the one that can offer any status to Puerto Rico or bind itself to offer any status. Congress has never appointed a commission that all of a sudden speaks for Congress and binds Congress in terms of particular status options for Puerto Rico. One option, one undeniable option is statehood. I agree that independence is an option. I say it with respect. I agree that Puerto Rico could try to negotiate or have a compact or pact of association, free association, such as the one that the Palau and the Marshall Islands have. Those are options, I agree, but those options have never gotten majority support in Puerto Rico. And if anybody wants to hold an up or down vote on them, I welcome them to do it because they'll end up getting a very small vote on them. Statehood has got the majority support in Puerto Rico, and it only will grow if Congress offers it to the people of Puerto Rico and subjects it to a vote once again by the people of Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Governor, and you spoke very well about it. That's what I was going to say, but you said it so well. And so thank you for your support and what you're testifying before the Congress. Mr. Chairman, if I have any time left, I'll yield it to the Congress lady, Ms. Poland. And with that, I yield to her.
Unfortunately, Mr. Young, you have no time left, but I'm sure she appreciates the gesture, and thank you. And let me now turn to and recognize Chairman Lowenthal for any questions or comments that he might have. Sir.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. And before I actually get into this debate, I just wanted to send to you and to the family of your staff member, Mr. Lofgren's family, my sincerest condolences. And I know this is a difficult time, suddenly the loss, and I just send my best wishes and my sadness for what you're going through.
And
with that,
thank you,
I'm here to listen. I don't really have too many questions. I'm trying to understand, and I think it's been an excellent hearing providing the alternatives. The only questions I have may be for the governor, Pedro, and I think also it's good to see you back on the Natural Resources Committee. As one of the old timers, glad to see you, as Jared also mentioned. I just want to know, and from your point of view, you've made your case, I think, because that the will of Puerto Ricans is that the majority have voted for statehood now, and that's what they want. What are the consequences if we wait longer to resolve this status? If the Congress does not act, do you have any ideas what is going to happen? What are some of the consequences of not acting?
Yes, I tell you, I live through them right now as governor. And I know Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez suffers through them every day in her tenure in Congress. I tell you, Jennifer Gonzalez is doing a remarkable job as a resident commissioner, but she's only one, and she doesn't have a vote on the floor. I know what she has to go through when she's seeking support for Puerto Rico for the Medicaid program, for the SSI program, for our nutrition assistance. She needs to go and talk to all of you and use her persuasion, her personality to convince you to go along with her, because she cannot vote on your bills. She cannot negotiate like it is done in Congress every day on our behalf. And she's only one in the House. Because of our population, size of our population, we would have 2 senators and 4 representatives at bat for us, for Puerto Rico. And I know that would make a difference. We suffered a huge hurricane. We went through a huge hurricane back in 2017. We went through incredible earthquakes early in 2020. And now we're facing the pandemic. And we went through all of that. And unfortunately, when the time came to assist Puerto Rico using existing disaster management programs of the federal government, we were facing all kinds of requirements that states do not face, because it is so easy to treat Puerto Rico differently. Actually, the Supreme Court has said that Congress can treat us differently, that the federal government can treat us differently. Our quest is always treat me the same. We are American citizens. Give me the same treatment in all federal programs, and give me representation in the Congress that approves the laws that affect me on a daily basis. Allow me to vote for the president. Allow me to vote for the commander-in-chief. Our men and women are wearing the military uniform, are losing their lives on behalf of this nation. Yet, when they come home, they have no say in our democracy. That's the quandary. That's the fight. And definitely, we want to put an end to it. And I say this again with respect. I say it with respect because the situation of Puerto Rico is not the same as as the other territories. Because of our size, because of the everything that we've been dealing with in the past, and because of the vote that just happened, we need to address this issue and do it for the benefit of all, for the benefit of the nation at large, and for the benefit of Puerto Rico. And let's do it fairly. Let's hold it for a vote once again. We just held a vote. Let's have another one. Once Congress offers equality, statehood to the American citizens of Puerto Rico.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal, and thank you for your kind comments. Appreciate it very much by all. Let me now recognize gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, for, no, excuse me. Let me recognize the full ranking member of the committee, Mr. Westerman, for your comments. Sir?
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and also a big thank you to all the witnesses. This is a very informative hearing that we're having today, and it seems to me it's obvious we've got two proposed processes to move forward, and it's great to be able to put those two processes side by side and to debate the merits of each one. Dr. Ponce-Krauss, and according to Representative Velasquez's summary of HR 2070 on our website, where she talks about the status convention, there's been a lot of talk about how there are three options to consider: statehood, independence, or free association. But the status convention offers a fourth option, or actually, I would say, a Pandora's box of options. And you say in your testimony that there are only three options and no room for other options. Will you explain that again?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the opportunity to explain it. My emphasis, and the emphasis you've heard from other speakers, on the fact that there are only, I said, two options, but you're right that there's one that's described as a third. It's statehood and independence, with or without free association. So let's call them three: statehood, independence, and free association. Free association is a form of independence. And the reason it's so critical to emphasize that is because the people of Puerto Rico were led to believe that there was another alternative. It was non-territorial. And that turned out not to be true. And what's so urgent is for the people of Puerto Rico not to be led along, not to be misled, not to be offered options they can't have. That doesn't respect them or the process of self-determination. So to say you can't have this is not to disrespect them. To say you can't have this is to respect them. So that option that they were offered repeatedly, that was not constitutionally possible, was non-territorial Commonwealth. And let me just try to explain what are the stakes of this debate. So I think one statistic, one figure that has been lost in all of this, I don't think I've heard this, is that Puerto Ricans have had an overwhelming consensus, and I'm talking on the order of 90%, for decades, since the mid-20th century, those same 70 years, we've had a consensus that people want to remain US citizens and have a guarantee of citizenship for themselves and their posterity. And they want some form of union with the United States, which is absolutely consistent with being Puerto Rican.
Do you believe that
want these two things? And if you want a union with the United States and citizenship for yourself and your posterity, well, then statehood is your only option, because the other options don't guarantee you either of those things. So that's what this debate is all about. How do we maintain citizenship for ourselves and our posterity and a union with the United States? If there were other ways to do it, that would be okay. And I too want to say what the governor said. I respect the option of independence. I respect the option of free association, but I also respect the expression of the Puerto Rican people's desire for a union with the United States of some form and guaranteed citizenship for themselves and their posterity. And if that's what they want, then it respects them, at the very least, to offer statehood, which is all the Admission Act does. It offers them statehood.
Thank you. And Section 6 of H.R. 2070 bonds Congress to pass a joint resolution in the future. I know you're a constitutional lawyer. Can Congress bind itself to pass a joint resolution in the future?
No, it cannot. So that's yet another promise that shouldn't be made to Puerto Ricans, because Congress can't bind itself to pass a joint resolution in the future. So H.R. 2070 says Congress shall enact a joint resolution ratifying the people's choice in a referendum following the Constitutional Convention. That sounds, once again, like you're giving them what they want. You're hearing them out, and then you're giving them what they want, and you're promising to do it. But Congress shouldn't make promises to the Puerto Rican people that it can't keep.
So what would happen if the bill passed, the convention puts forward options, the people vote, and then send an option to Congress? Would Congress have to act?
Congress would not have to act. So if the people choose a constitutional non-territorial option, Congress should act, but Congress wouldn't have to act. And that ought to be clear as well.
Do you think there's some this bill would be or is misleading to the Puerto Rican people?
It is. It invites them to debate options that they can't have, along with the ones they can. It invites them to debate options that they can't have, that they've already debated, that we know aren't constitutional. And then it invites them to send that choice to Congress and promises Congress will act when Congress can't promise to do that. So the Puerto Rican people have been led along long enough.
Thank you, Dr. Ponte-Krause, and I'm out of time, so I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Let me now recognize gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, for your time, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. It doesn't, it weighs on my mind knowing right now that President Biden is talking about our movement out of Afghanistan. It does, and of course, reminds me that there have been a total of 77 Puerto Ricans from down in Puerto Rico that have died both in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well more than 1,700 injured. So this is actually very important to me. I've never understood why the Puerto Ricans I serve with were treated as second-class citizens, and that their citizenship could be decided by their zip codes. And I'm very happy to see that we're at least having a debate about where and how we should proceed with the statehood question of Puerto Rico. I do find it odd that some Democrats are arguing that this last election that Puerto Rico had, the referendum, is somehow illegitimate after we just had a huge January 6th fight with our colleagues across the aisle who are trying to call that election illegitimate. I think that is something that I don't know how we can reconcile. The referendum that was put forward by duly elected members of the state of Puerto Rico, or the State House of Puerto Rico. That's a language. It was supported. I don't understand where somehow there's a mandate has to be hit by a number that is above, I guess 52% is not acceptable. Somehow in normal American mainland politics, if you get 50+1, that's a mandate. Sometimes we've had presidents that have not even hit 50% of the population, and they have popular vote, and they have won, and yet we have considered that a mandate. And now, the other argument I'm hearing that also does not make sense, like, well, there's multiple parties that were elected last cycle to the State House and State Senate. I understand that, but I also know Puerto Rican politics is not just about statehood and about statehood questions. There are a lot of other reasons why people vote for different members of the State House and State Senate over there, and it's not just statehood. And lastly, just as an Arizonan, the 48th state that did get accepted into Congress, if we were living by the standard right now, I'm actually fighting in Arizona to preserve Proposition, I think, 108, which is a tax increase the majority of Arizonans voted for, but the Arizona legislature actually is controlled by Republicans. And their argument is, well, the Arizona legislature is a better reflection of what truly Arizonans want instead of the referendum that we passed. So it would be extremely hypocritical of me to somehow use those two standards. Number one, the fact that, we had a free and legitimate election last time, and it should not have been questioned by our colleagues across the aisle. And number two, that this Arizona state legislature should be listening to the will of the voters and then somehow turn and not support this. So that's my general statement. I'd also like to talk to Professor, and I apologize, my screen's going a little blank in terms of names here. Professor, what is your name? I apologize. Christina Kraus. So, Christina Kraus. Thank you, Professor. So the argument here is that we need to restart it, right? We need to restart this by pulling delegates together and then putting a constitutional convention together. So what states actually did that in the past?
Well, no states did anything like this in the past.
Okay.
So, yes.
So that good question. Thank you for answering that question. Okay.
I mean, if you're referring to the process provided for in HR 2070?
Yeah.
Yeah, no territory did anything like this because no territory had this range of options and confusion and this long a debate about an option that turns out not even to have been constitutional. We spent 70 years arguing about it. There's no precedent for this.
Okay. And even if it was even remotely possible that this could work out, it doesn't have a time period. It doesn't sound like there's a definitive time period that this has to be decided for. So let's say they go through these elections, they have they elect their delegates. It sounds like the delegates get elected by popular vote, I'm assuming. But when does the decision have to be made? So let's say they get, the popular vote, delegates get selected. Is there a time period? Like, is there 2 years, a year? What are we talking about? Can this go indefinitely?
HR 27 does not contain any time limit either for the terms of the delegates or for the convention to produce a result. In fact, I can't tell you how my heart sank when I read the requirement that certain reports be submitted every 12 months. I thought, really? 123 years isn't enough?
Yeah. And then even how they come to a decision, is that defined? I mean, is it just like, let's say for some reason the statehooders receive the majority of the votes and delegate votes. Can they just quickly call a convention together and say, okay, we're good, let's do this?
So the bill doesn't explain exactly how the convention itself would go about the process of debating.
Right.
And I certainly am a believer in all voices being heard, but I believe that all voices were heard in the referendum as well.
And lastly, so again, just to be clear, has the United States government ever dictated to a territory exactly what they need to discuss in order for them to come back and talk to us about joining the union?
Well, what the United States government has never done is send people off, first of all, ignore a referendum in which a majority voted for statehood and say, actually, no, we don't like the process you came up with. We want you to do something else, and then call that self-determination. I mean, I can't put those two things together. How do you just ignore a vote on the island provided for by its own elected representatives and say, no, actually do this other thing because we respect self-determination?
Right. But self-determination to me means the local state representatives and senators decided to put a language on. When people voted for these state reps and state senators, they knew what they represented. And then it got on there and it was the most popular thing that was voted on. So I think if anything, this reeks of a sort of paternalism from us stateside members of Congress. Why am I going to override the local elected officials that are closest to democracy after they have clearly spoken? So with that, I'm full support of Representative Soto's bill, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Mr. Lamborn, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this has been a very good discussion. I want to say hello to my former colleague and the governor of Puerto Rico, Governor Pelagosi. It was good to visit with you recently when I was in Puerto Rico. I visited with you and the delegate, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon. And one thing about Jennifer that I want to say, she's not expecting me to say this, but I was astounded by the affection and the effectiveness that she brings to the table as the delegate from Puerto Rico. I was in the State House, the capital of the territory, and I saw a row of oil portraits, former speakers of the General Assembly there, and Jennifer's picture was the last in the row, and I thought I was very impressed by that. In fact, here I took a if you can see it on my phone here on the screen, that's the oil portrait of the former Speaker of the Puerto Rico legislature. I'm going to yield the rest of my time to my friend and colleague, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon.
Ms. Colon, you're recognized. Gonzalez. Gentlelady's recognized.
Jennifer, you have to unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Sablan.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you, Mr. Lamborn. I mean, I'm humbled by your words, and I really appreciate your willingness always to work with our governor and everything you've been doing in the committee. My gratitude to you for visiting the island and visiting certain places that are jurisdiction of this committee, like the national parks, in terms of how they were recovering. Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. And I want to say thank you as well to Mr. Dongyon, Lowenthal, Gallego, that just made brilliant questions. And I will take it where you leave it. In terms of, and I will do these questions to Professor Ponsa Kraus. First of all, thank you for your willingness to be a witness here and to answering direct questions. And my line of questions will be now a yes or no in terms of, saving time. And if you can just tell me yes or no, I will really appreciate that. Will the Mission Act that Darren Soto and I submitted in this Congress impose statehood for Puerto Rico? Would voters of the islands always have the last say on that?
No, it will not impose, and yes, they will have the last say.
And thank you for that. Some argue that the results of November of last year are invalid or legitimate mandate for statehood because the vote wasn't federally sponsored or sanctioned by Congress or the Department of Justice. Others claim that an absolute majority of 53% isn't enough, as Congressman Gallego just established. First question, are these constitutionally sound arguments, yes or no?
No.
Does the U.S. Constitution require a specific level of majority support for statehood in order to admit a territory as a state?
No.
Does it require a federally sponsored referendum as a prerequisite for Congress to act?
No.
Did we have that requirement before for Alaska and Hawaii?
No.
Do any other state was required when they were a territory to have an absolute majority or a specific percentage to be admitted as a union?
No.
Should Puerto Rico require that?
No.
Question. In our bill, Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act addressed the concerns by authorizing a self-executing process that will have ratified by voters. Do you think that is a self-executing bill? Yes or no?
The Admission Act, yes.
Do you think the HR 2070 is a self-executing bill?
No.
Do you think that is a binding bill?
No.
Do you think that the Department of Justice declining to fund a campaign disqualify or take out any legitimacy of a voter's result in November of last year?
No.
Thank you, Professor Pons. With that, I yield back.
General,
I yield back to you.
Lambert yields. Let me recognize sponsor of legislation, Ms. Velasquez. You're recognized.
Pero Darren Soto antes que ella. For seniority en el comité. Huh?
You need to turn off your mic, Jennifer.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to address the issue of the binding nature of my bill. Section 7, joint resolution, outlines a serious and structured process for both chambers of Congress to act upon the results of the referendum that my bill proposes. And let me just say this to my colleagues in this committee. This is not an election for president. It's not an election of a member of Congress. This is an election about decolonization. 123 years of imperialism by the United States. How do we morally put an end to colonization? How do we empower the people of Puerto Rico to finally decide what is their choice made by the people of Puerto Rico? So, the governor, Pierluisi, talk about, how the percentage of vote of Biden, of Nydia Velasquez in my own district. This is not about that type of election. This is the most consequential act that will be taken by the people of Puerto Rico and the United States Congress. And let it be known to this committee that the November 2020 plebiscite was legislated, designed, and pushed by only one party in Puerto Rico, and that is the pro-statehood party that Governor Pierluisi represents. So if we are honest and serious about providing a path for the people of Puerto Rico, for all political sectors to be able to decide their own future, why are you so afraid? My bill doesn't preclude or exclude statehood. And if you are so assured that the outcome is going to be statehood, why then opposing a process that is inclusive, that is transparent, and that is democratic? So I would like to address my first question to Governor Acevedo Vilá. Could you please explain to the members of the committee the steps that have historically taken place in Puerto Rico to design and implement previous plebiscite? Could you explain to us the context on how the 2020 plebiscite came into existence, and if any voices from the opposition were taken into consideration?
Well, the short answer, Congresswoman, thank you for the question, is no. Nobody was considered in terms of the other political parties in Puerto Rico. It was approved without any votes of the other political parties in the House and in the Senate. And actually, the whole design was precisely to be a one-sided campaign, because it was together with the elections. The other parties, they were not in power. They had the control of the whole apparatus of the government. The other parties had to spend all the money that they raised for their own campaigns for elected officials. And if you compare the numbers, this was one-sided. And I would love members who are favoring the statehood bill to see some of the ads that were put out there, basically scaring people, saying if you vote no, you're going to lose your U.S. citizenship. If you vote no, you won't get the nutrition assistance programs.
Thank you.
So that's totally one-sided.
Time is running out, and I have many questions to ask. Thank you, Mr. Acevedo. Mr. Natal, you recently sued the Puerto Rico State Election Commissions for issues arising in your bid to become mayor of San Juan. Mr. Natal, can you provide the members of this committee with some example of how the electoral reform law affected the election results, and if such reforms created a lack of transparency, voter disenfranchisement, and other electoral deterrents?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman Velasquez, and I'll go right to it. Not only did the New Progressive Party unilaterally legislated this referendum one-sided, but they also changed the electoral laws in Puerto Rico 136 days before the election. So they decided to change the rules of the game 136 days before the actual election was supposed to be taking place. And particularly when it comes to the plebiscite, I'll give you just one example. In the case of the 5 precincts of San Juan, when it comes to the plebiscite, as in an act certified by 4 of the 5 parties from the Electoral Commission, it was found that there were close to 1,800 votes or 1,800 ballots in excess of actual voters for the plebiscite only in terms of the election in San Juan. That's just one example of the many irregularities that happened. And I'll clear one more thing, Congresswoman Velasquez. The actual percentage of what the statehood received when you take into account invalid votes and blank votes was actually 50.8%, not the 52 that's been said here before.
And I would like to remind the members of the committee also that the Department of Justice rejected the 2017 and 2020 referendum, citing the Obama Task Force report that stated that excluding options will call into question the legitimacy of any referendum. I yield back.
Lady yields, and the time over. If anybody has a question about that, is exactly the same for members that were pro the other piece of legislation that went over 1 minute and 37 seconds and 1 minute and 26 seconds. So there was no effort to give to Ms. Velasquez any additional time. It was only being consistent with what other people received. Let me now turn to Ms. Radewagen. The gentlelady, the time is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Westerman for holding this hearing. Welcome to the panel, and thank you. As a fellow member representing a U.S. territory, I want to align myself with the statements made today by Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon. Above all else, today's hearing is about respecting the will of the Puerto Rican people, and she is their duly elected representative. And with that, I yield my time to the resident commissioner.
Thank you, Amara, for yielding. I really appreciate all your support and your co-sponsorship of this bill today. And I would love to continue my line of questions to Professor Ponce, if she's available as well. And I would love to maintain a yes or no answer so we can get a hold of the time. Not without saying, my first question will be, is the blank vote count for electing somebody to any position?
No.
I assume that. In your view, HR 2070, the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, did you believe that it's problematic that this bill does not define or recognize that the only non-territorial status options available are for Puerto Rico or statehood or independence?
Yes.
In your view, will the Self-Determination Act open up the door for convention delegates to come up with unconstitutional options?
Yes.
Do you think that including unconstitutional provisions in the transition plans they have to develop may be opposed by Congress?
I apologize. I couldn't really follow whether that.
If that constitutional convention use or creates a new definition of status that is not non-territorial, Congress and the Department of Justice can just say no to that.
That's right, yes.
Is there any constitutional concerns with the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act?
No.
In your testimony, you argue that the Self-Determination Act is, and I quote, a thinly veiled attempt to delay and defeat an offer for statehood. Can you elaborate on why you think that?
Absolutely. The Self-Determination Act ignores the referendum in November and displaces it with a process altogether different from the process that Puerto Rico came up with. And I've heard people say Puerto Rico's statehood party designed the referendum. Puerto Rico's elected legislators designed the referendum. The Self-Determination Act recognizes the inherent right of Puerto Rico to exercise self-determination. Well, this is it. Puerto Rico's elected legislatures designed the referendum. They're the ones who put this process in place.
Professor, do you believe the Self-Determination Acts engage in election denial?
Yes.
Do you think that ignoring and rejecting Puerto Rico's recent votes on statehood, not just the 2020, 2017, and 2012 referendum, are those actions undemocratic?
Yes.
In your opinion, was November 2020 results on statehood and yes or no referendum legitimate in self-determination process?
Yes.
Do you think that as a professor of constitutional law and American legal history, how do you respond to the arguments that the Self-Determination Act have stated that the convention authorized by the bill will consider statehood independence of free association, which is independence, and any other non-territorial options? How do you believe that is consistent with U.S. law?
So to the extent that it invites Puerto Ricans to debate options that are not constitutional, it's not consistent with U.S. law. To the extent that it invites Puerto Ricans to debate options at all instead of responding to the plebiscite, to the referendum in November, it's unnecessary and it's dilatory. Puerto Ricans can continue debating their options even if Congress offers statehood. And in response to the referendum, Congress should offer statehood.
Thank you, Professor. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Ms. Weatherwagon yields back. Let me recognize Mr. McEachin. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to go into a long series of questions. Rather, I'm just going to state for the record my support for Mr. Soto's bill, and I look forward to the day that I can be part of a delegation welcoming the people of Puerto Rico into the Union. And with that, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Soto.
Thank you, Representative McEachin. And first, I want to thank you, Chairman, for hosting this hearing dedicated to Puerto Rico's political status. After the election in November, we deserve a real debate on this, and we're getting it today, finally. And I want to thank Ranking Member Westerman as well for that opportunity. I was more than happy to have Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon begin speaking on behalf of our bill together, because my motivation is to lift up voices from Puerto Rico, not from the state side. That's been the problem all along. Yesterday, we celebrated National Buccaneers Day. Heroes who fought for this country since 1899, for many years in segregated units. And to date, Puerto Ricans enlist in the armed services at double the rate of those on the mainland. Yet none of them can vote for commander-in-chief, have senators, or voting representatives in Congress. That is a national shame. My family's native island of Puerto Rico has been through so much hardship over the last few years, an over decade-long economic recession, deadly hurricanes Maria and Irma, terrible budget cuts from the Promesa Fiscal Board, earthquakes, and now COVID-19. It's clear now that 2 senators and 4 representatives would have greatly helped during these crises, and that the territorial status is failing 3.2 million Americans there. We see this every day in Central Florida as thousands of Puerto Ricans feel they have to leave the island to come to our region because they no longer think they could be prosperous on the island. This is an injustice, and this is the main motivation why I'm here to help lift up voices on the island. Amidst the chaos, the Puerto Rico legislature decided to do something about it. they passed legislation to hold a vote on the future political status of the island. Unlike past elections, the ballot language was simple. It was a statehood yes or no question voted on during a high turnout 2020 general election, and the people voted by a majority of 52.52% for statehood. This was higher than any gubernatorial candidate, our resident commissioner, or even any party, all of whom won by pluralities, as opposed to a simple majority. The fact is, the statehood vote crossed many party lines to get to the majority. The numbers just evidence that. And this is why I filed the Puerto Rico Statehood Admissions Act along with Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon and many others. Because in democracy, when the people vote, action is supposed to occur afterwards. Governments change, leaders change, and political statuses change. That is the essence of our republic. We vote and a majority rules. Our bill would still set up one last binding election. Statehood, yes or no. And if a majority votes yes, they'd be admitted to the union after a brief transition period. And if they vote no, then it would be no. There are other factions that I am more than happy to bring to light. A minority of Puerto Ricans on the island are pushing for a concept called enhanced Commonwealth status. This is, of course, not a thing. Dr. Ponce Krause mentioned it at length today, and I'm not going to belabor it other than to say it's a fictional status where Puerto Rico would get most of the benefits of statehood without any of the burdens. Feel free to review our Constitution or the letter from the professor as well as other top constitutional law experts, which has already been submitted for the record, but if not, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit it. The Constitution is clear. Puerto Rico could choose statehood, territory, or independence. Free association doesn't need to be on the ballot. It would be a decision if Puerto Rico decided to be independent, whether they want to be a free association like Palau or whether they'd want to be independent without a relationship. So the choices have been clear for a long time, which brings me to the other bill. Why would we have a constitutional convention when the three options are already clear? Perhaps to create lofty demands to the United States that will never happen, but it will in fact cause critical delay during a limited window of opportunity for Puerto Rico to finally resolve its second-class citizenship. Other problems with the convention bill, it creates a new legislative body when Puerto Rico already has a legislature. And it also purports to allow for meaningful debate to decolonize Puerto Rico. But the Puerto Rican legislature has been debating this for 100
Thank
years.
you.
And my time's expired.
Mr. Soto, you'll be recognized for your own time right after our Republican colleague has his 5 minutes. And let me recognize Mr. Obernolte for his time. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. It's been a fascinating hearing on a very important topic. My question is directed towards Congresswoman Velasquez. I had a couple of questions about HR 2070. And first, let me ask, the bill requires that whatever the results of the referendum are, that Congress ratify the results, including, I assume, a result of a vote for independence. However, we've heard testimony from some of the witnesses here that requiring a future Congress to ratify the results of the referendum would be illegal. Do you disagree with that?
Well, first and foremost, I am not one of the witnesses, but if you repeat your question, I will be more than happy to answer. I wasn't paying attention.
Oh, I'm sorry. So my question was about your bill, HR 2070.
Yes.
The bill requires that Congress ratify the result of the referendum in Puerto Rico. However, there's been testimony here today at the hearing that requiring a future Congress to ratify the results of the referendum would be illegal. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, I disagree. Congress we create a commission. I stated clearly that under Section 7 Joint Resolution outlines a serious and structured process for both chambers of Congress to act upon the results of the referendum that my bill proposes.
Okay, so presumably, even if the result of the referendum is a vote for independence, there would be, I'm sure, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of issues that would have to be determined, both financial and legal status. So how could we require a future Congress to just blindly ratify that result?
Again, Section 7 will provide and will outline a process for the commission that is going to be appointed by leaders of the House and the Senate to come into negotiations. This is a process of decolonization. And clearly, there is language in the bill that will provide a process for that to be achieved.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. And then lastly, if I could ask about another section of the bill that establishes the Puerto Rico Status Convention Public Matching Fund and appropriates $5.5 million to establish a 4-to-1 match for not just paying for the election, but paying for the campaigns of Puerto Ricans that wish to become delegates. So I personally have a problem with that. How is it fair to use taxpayers that are collected from U.S. tax dollars collected from U.S. taxpayers to fund the election campaigns of candidates in Puerto Rico, particularly on a 4-to-1 ratio?
So, sir, this is decolonization, and we have a moral obligation to provide whatever it takes for the people of Puerto Rico to be well informed as to what their vote or their choosing mean for themselves and their family. And by the way, we do that every day. We do it in New York and other states where we provide matching funds because we want to make sure that not only the wealthiest 1%, whether they are here or in Puerto Rico, have the opportunity to be engaged and participate democratically. But you should address the same question to the governor of Puerto Rico. Right now, they are asking for millions of dollars to have shadow representatives and senators so that they could come to Congress and lobby for statehood. And this is money from taxpayers. This is money that we have sent to Puerto Rico for the rebuilding of Puerto Rico. Do you support that?
Certainly, and I also support the funding of the referendum in Puerto Rico, but I can't support the funding of campaigns in Puerto Rico.
You will support that the government will use public funds to hold this special election at a time when Puerto Rico continues to face a financial crisis and a bankruptcy process. And by the way, today, unanimously, the Promesa board voted against it because it's wrong.
Well, to be clear, Congresswoman, I think that we have an obligation to hold elections, but I want to thank you very much for your candid answers to the questions. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield the balance of my time, but let me expense.
There is no balance. I'm sorry, Mr.
To you and for the loss of your
kind.
And that unfortunate death occurred in my district. If I can be of any service to you, just let me know.
And let me thank your staff for their inquiries and their response to local law enforcement. Very kind of them, and we're all very appreciative of that. Thank you, sir. Let me now return to sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Soto. Time is yours.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. Now, we talked a lot about my bill already, just a few concerns about the competing bill. First, we've heard at length that there's 3 choices: statehood, territorial independence. Association is just a type of independence. We wouldn't need that on the ballot. If Puerto Ricans have picked independence, they could decide whether or not they want to be free association or not. The second concern is it's a critical delay of an issue that's been debated for over 100 years during a limited window of opportunity to finally resolve the second-class citizenship of Puerto Rico. And then third, it creates a new legislative body on top of the Puerto Rico legislature, which is already elected and has, trust me, debates this every day. It also purports to allow meaningful debate to decolonize Puerto Rico, but that's untrue. because colonization is about ignoring elections. That's colonization, ignoring 3 elections in favor of statehood. Lastly, it's got to be stated that a lot of these issues are pushed by a minority of Puerto Ricans who live on the mainland who support independence. Puerto Ricans who live in states and use their clout in Congress to prevent our brothers and sisters on the island from finally resolving their political status. I've never been opposed to independence. If I thought there was a good chance, that would be another great option. But we know independence polls in the single digits routinely on the island. Puerto Ricans value their American citizenship. We've heard that over and over today. Being part of the United States lifts up their quality of life. They pledge allegiance to the flag and they serve in the U.S. military in staggering numbers. So what do you do if you can't win an election? You delay. Justice delayed is justice denied. And I want to also quote our majority leader, Steny Hoyer, just signed on to our bill this week. And he is, Mr. Chairman, if I may move to submit his written testimony for the record. He says, I quote, "The people of Puerto Rico have told us time and time again through multiple plebiscites in recent years that they chose statehood. I think that we in Congress would be wise to listen to what the people of Puerto Rico are telling us. We also have constitutional experts from the Congress supporting it, like Jamie Raskin, because he understands that there's really only 3 options and we've already had a vote. We have fellow Puerto Ricans like Richie Torres and Jennifer Gonzalez Colon supporting our bill. We have progressives, centrists, and conservatives supporting our bill, including over 60 House sponsors, many from the Hispanic caucus, many from the territories, as well as Senators Heinrich, Padilla, Wyden, and Schatz, because it represents the enforcement and recognition of democracy. Ultimately, should our bill pass, Puerto Ricans will have one last election to vote to become a state or not. If they truly want to remain a territory or become independent, they could vote no. And if they want to become a state, they will vote yes. I ask the Congress, let our people vote. Let the will of the majority prevail and let democracy be done in these United States of America, and not let this be about personalities or alliances. It should be about the vote. I wanted to talk to some of the witnesses that we've invited today. Ms. Velez Garcia, are there a lot of progressives who support the plebiscite and statehood on the island?
Yes, actually. Supporting equality across the board without being selective is at the heart of being a progressive. And as you know, within the Democratic Party, the progressive movement has gained gigantic steps. I understand that there are progressives within the rank and file of the Democratic Party that do not support statehood, certainly. And you know, we are a big house and we are respectful of everyone's opinion. But as you said yourself, there is no better exercise on democracy than the casting of the ballot. And we have—
Thank you so much. My time is limited.
Yes,
Mr.
sorry.
Fuentes, are there many conservatives on the island who support statehood as well?
Question there. As you know, the Republican Party is island and Puerto Rico are extreme at the highest level of home ownership country, at the highest level, second only to Nevada, in military participation. We have more churches per square mile than anywhere in the country. So yes, the answer to your question is an absolute yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, and my time's expired.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soto. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Tiffany, you're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, as with each of our meetings here in House Natural Resources, we've had glitches in technology. I'm asking the chairman to bring us into committee rooms. It's time to do that so that there is clear communication in what is supposed to be the greatest deliberative body created in the history of mankind. So I'm going to yield my time to Ms. Gonzalez I just hear lots of noise from people here, some politicians in America about this. And I wanted to hear from the person who's closest to the people, and that's Ms. Gonzalez. And I know she has spoken about this issue earlier today. And but I would like to hear her thoughts on where she sees this going. I yield to Ms. Gonzalez.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Mr. Tiffany for yielding and for your respect and deference to the people elected from the island to manage this issue. And as you just said, the issue of Puerto Rico has been discussed for more than 100 years. We've been discussing statehood, independence, a kind of free association, which you need to become an independent nation in order to get that kind of negotiation like the Marshall Islands or the Micronesia Islands. And that's not what the people of Puerto Rico want. Even in the past, when there's been several votes on this, people of the island cherish American citizenship. And that's the reason in the last 3 plebiscites, statehood have won those plebiscites. That's the will of the people of the island. So I want to say thank you for yielding. And that's the reason after the results of November of last year, we drafted this bill in a different way. We took the same process Alaska and Hawaii did in order to become a state, what those territories did in order to become a state, and that was the yes or no legislation on the island. That was the way State House and State Senate legislated this during the last year. And with that vote, yes or no vote, we are answering to that request and that request of statehood and equality with the statehood bill. And that statehood bill, I need to say thank you to Congressman Darren Soto and to many others, Democrats and Republicans, that are supporting this bill in the House, including the majority leader, Mr. Hoyer, who just included his testimony for this hearing. And I want to say thank you for sponsoring State of Puerto Rico as well. I will make a question to Mr. Jose Fuentes for the Puerto Rico Statehood Council. I know the Governor Pelagosi a few minutes ago said that people who campaign against statehood were here today, are here today as witnesses, now trying to discredit or trying to stop the result of last November. My questions to you is, all those people that campaigned and voted against the statehood bill in the yes or no questions in November, do they have the right to overcome that minority and being a minority that were defeated in many ways, now try to impose those alternatives?
No, they don't. What we have to understand is that this is a process that started with the Young Bill. There have been 5 different referendums, 3 of them in the last 10 years. All 3 have been won by statehood. So this is not something that happened at the last minute like they're trying to portray. But it's the same process that has been followed by 32 territories that became states, most recently Alaska and Hawaii. So what we're seeing here is the progression of the Northwest Ordinance established by our forefathers. Now, the beauty of this last vote is that if you believed that Puerto Rico should be returned to Spain, or if you believed that Puerto Rico should be a part of the moon, you had a place to vote. You voted no. So it's all against one. And that is the final vote that statehood had to win before Congress pushes this over the line, before more people leave the island. 800,000 Puerto Ricans have left the island in the last 20 years.
Mr. Fuentes, I'll make, my time is getting short. So, you know, a few minutes ago, when the witnesses were saying in their testimony, some of them said that the negotiation committee will inevitably lay out a rejection of statehood, either directly or by imposing impossible conditions. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, the opposite is also the same, right? If we have another vote like your bill calls for,
you need to wrap up your answer, sir.
Have been decided, then if the people don't like them, they will vote against them. And then that will be the end of the statehood movement.
Mr. Fuentes, you need to wrap up your answer. Thank you. Let me now, let me now turn to Mr. Garcia. Sir, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member for this hearing. In 2021, it's 2021 and Puerto Rico is still a colony, the oldest in the world. From the annexation of the island to a century of limited citizenship, the imposition of promesa, and our failures in disaster response, we know that Puerto Rico's relationship with the U.S. is rooted in a history of racism, exploitation, and oppression. While many may disagree about the future of Puerto Rico's status, we must recognize that the decision should come from those who will be impacted most, the people of Puerto Rico. We have an opportunity to rectify Puerto Rico's longstanding colonial status, which has resulted in its people being treated as second-class citizens, but it must be done correctly and with transparency. I'd like to explore some topics that haven't gotten a whole lot of attention in this hearing yet. So I'd like to ask the Governor Pierluisi regarding the Fiscal Oversight Board, or La Junta. They propose, cutting pension, the University of Puerto Rico's budget, additional austerity measures to make room for Wall Street bondholders. I know that you've opposed some of these measures. With respect to the present conversation about the status of Puerto Rico, given the final word is left, of course, to the Junta, my first question to you is, how does Puerto Rico's $70 billion debt restructuring work under statehood? If you would be brief, because I have some more questions I'd like to ask you, sir.
Well, I'll be brief. That process is ongoing, and the bill, HR 1522, provides that basically all laws, all regulations in place remain in effect unless they're inconsistent with the legislation itself. My expectation is that the restructuring of the Commonwealth's debt will be done and over with at the latest by middle of next year, and it could be earlier.
But doesn't the final plan, Governor, of adjustment saddle Puerto Rico with billions in yearly debt service for 40 years?
Well, actually, that's debt that Puerto Rico incurred, and as the legislation provides, whatever bonds or obligations Puerto Rico has, Puerto Rico keeps, because that's the way it should be. We are restructuring it, and through under promesa, and we will be achieving incredible savings in terms of the payments that we will be making for the next 30 years. You're talking about a very significant reduction in the debt service that Puerto Rico will be paying as a territory until it becomes a state, and then as a state thereafter.
And if Puerto Rico were admitted as a state under the Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act, how would taxation of Puerto Rico residents and companies operating in the island change?
The bill provides that Puerto Rico would become a state on an equal footing with the other states. There's only one statehood. You cannot change it. That's why statehood is so straightforward. We aspire to have the same rights and responsibilities. Obviously, you can transition Puerto Rico into the federal income tax system. That wouldn't be inconsistent with the tax uniformity clause of the U.S. Constitution, and that Congress can address within the time frame that the bill provides for, because the way this works is that once the people of Puerto Rico vote for statehood in the final referendum, and I anticipate it'll be an overwhelming vote, then the president has about a year to proclaim statehood. And within that time frame, within that year, Congress will be addressing all the different ways in which we need to conform the existing laws, programs, regulations, so that Puerto Rico becomes a state and a viable state.
Thank you, sir. And what do I have time for another question, Chairman?
Yes, quick one,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you.
Senator Lourdes Santiago, in your opinion, in your view, does Puerto Rico Statehood Admission Act explicitly outline a transition plan, and why is it so important for the residents of Puerto Rico to be included and made aware of this process?
El Partido Independentista se opone al proyecto 1522.
The Independent Party opposes Project 1522 bill,
Porque es una alternativa del todo excluyente respecto a las otras alternativas de estatus.
because it's an opportunity that is completely exclusive of the other status of options.
Aquí se ha estado hablando, por ejemplo, de que los puertorriqueños llevamos décadas en esta discusión sobre el tema del estatus.
For example, here we've been saying that Puerto Ricans have been discussing this issue of the Puerto Rican status for decades.
Pero ha sido una conversación en la que falta un interlocutor imprescindible.
But it's a conversation where a very important, critical speaker has been missing.
Que es el Congreso de los Estados Unidos.
And that is the U.S. Congress.
Puerto Rico no es una colonia de ningún partido político en Puerto Rico, es una colonia de los Estados Unidos.
Puerto Rico is not a colony of any party of Puerto Rico. It belongs to the United States.
Por eso el gran valor o uno de los grandes valores del 2070
That's why one of the greatest values of the HR 2070
es que obliga a esa conversación que el Congreso no ha querido tener.
is that it obligates us to have the conversation that the Congress
With
has
that,
not been willing to have.
We need to wrap up. We need to wrap up now. Time is over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia. Let me now recognize Mr. Moore for his time. Sir?
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, and those of you that are here today. Thank you for being here. Sincerely, this is an important issue. Regardless, with disagreements on how to move forward, I think we all share an appreciation for our fellow Americans in Puerto Rico, and hope to be able to continue these conversations and do something productive. My first question would be for Governor Pelagosi. Just again, can you just highlight very, very briefly the biggest challenges that you face due to Puerto Rico's status as a territory rather than a state?
Let's start with programs such as Medicaid. I mean, the 50 states have a Medicaid program providing for the health services needed by their medically indigent population, a low-income, moderate-income population. Puerto Rico doesn't have a permanent financing for this program. In the last couple of years, because of the disasters we faced, Congress increased the amount of funding that we get for purposes of our local Medicaid program. But you cannot budget for your health system on a year-to-year basis or on a 2-year cycle. You need a permanent program, fair for the American citizens in Puerto Rico. We're seriously underfunded as we speak. We do not cover 100% of the population falling before the poverty level in Puerto Rico in our Medicaid program, and we're far from being able to do so. So that's just one example. The Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, doesn't apply in Puerto Rico the same way. We're $1 billion short of nutrition assistance in the middle of the disaster, as it happened elsewhere in the nation. We got additional assistance, but it falls short again, and we have not a permanent treatment from the part of the federal government. With SSI, which is intended to assist people that are disabled, elderly, low income, disabled, doesn't apply at all in Puerto Rico. So those are just examples. On top of it, I tell you that the way federal disaster programs work in the mainland is different than in Puerto Rico. We're always facing different requirements. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has said that because we're a territory, we can be treated differently. And that's, again, it makes no sense as a matter of federal policy, because this is just like geographic discrimination. Puerto Ricans are not immigrants. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They hop on a plane if they don't get the health services that they are seeking. They hop on a plane if they don't have nutrition assistance as in the States. And I should add to this that the political uncertainty caused by this status that we have discourages investment into Puerto Rico. Once Puerto Rico settles its political status for once and for all, I am sure, I have no doubt, our economy will prosper. We will attract more investment. That happened in Alaska, that happened in Hawaii, that happened in New Mexico, that happened in Arizona. That's why all those territories aspire to become states, so their quality of life and the economic level of their territories would improve. So that's the vision. It's an empowering vision. And lastly, let me just say this, and again, with all due respect, a yes or no vote cannot be fair. A yes or no vote cannot be more inclusive. We had it on statehood. And all that we're doing now is telling Congress to say yes or no on statehood for Puerto Rico. It is the right thing to do. It is the courageous thing to do. And I welcome the debate, and I welcome all, including Puerto Ricans who want to oppose statehood. But let Congress address this issue. It is your responsibility, moral and legally.
Thank you. And to close, if you could also just comment, with the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act, to what extent were you or other key stakeholders brought into this for your input when it was drafted?
Meaning which legislation? I'm sorry.
Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act.
The Self-Determination Act, no, this bill, as far as I know, was drafted by its original co-sponsors. And I'm talking about the resident commissioner and Darren Soto. If you're talking about the other one, HR 27.
HR 2070.
Time is up, Mr. Moore.
If it's 2070, I have no idea who drafted that bill. I had no role in it. And
time is up, sir.
It ignores the vote that we just had.
Thank you. I yield back.
Yep. Thank you. Mr. Case, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like Mr. Lowenthal, I came to this hearing to really listen as carefully as I could. It's a critical decision, not just for Puerto Rico, but for our country. I also came with a sense of personal history and responsibility, having been born in the territory of Hawaii. Of course, Hawaii being the last state that was given a chance by the United States to serve as a state. After a very, very long struggle, by the way, similar to what you have all described today. My great-grandfather, as a matter of fact, was a delegate for statehood to this Congress probably 100 years ago. So I understand it, and I think I certainly believe that this time has come. Also, just from a perspective of free association, I want to emphasize, since I work directly with the countries of the Pacific that are in free association with our country, I just want to drive the point home one more time that free association is an association, a treaty between two independent countries. And so functionally it is independent. So I don't understand in all honesty, the discussion having to do with free association. Treaties are there. Treaties can be abrogated and countries go about their ways. So just to make that point, I want to say very directly something that just is from my heart. I'm strongly inclined to Mr. Soto and Ms. Gonzalez-Colon's proposal, but it does trouble me, in all honesty, that the indication from the voters of Puerto Rico thus far has not been at the same level of overwhelming agreement with statehood as, for example, Hawaii, which in 1941 was at 66%. The final plebiscite was 93% in 1959. In the case of Alaska in 1946, it was 60%, and by 1958, it had grown to 83%. So I just want to be honest. I do ask myself the policy question: is is the vote today enough to move forward with the process? And again, I think it is, but I just leave that with all of the folks. And I don't have a question, it's just an observation. I wish it was higher because then it would be an easier decision. And with that, I want to defer my time, the remainder of my time, to Ms. Velasquez, because I want her to have the opportunity to ask further questions.
Thank you, the gentleman, for yielding. Senator Santiago, as a proponent of independence for Puerto Rico, could you please explain to this committee the importance for Puerto Ricans to understand the implications of statehood or any other option, what it will mean for the island?
En primer lugar, la única opción que representa un derecho inalienable es la independencia.
First of all, the only option that represents an inalienable and must right is independence.
Tanto la libre asociación, que requeriría la ratificación de un tratado, como la estadidad, requieren la participación, la afirmativa del Congreso de los Estados Unidos.
The libre association option, which would have to be ratified by a treaty, such as statehood, affirmative action by the Congress of the United States.
Y aquí me parece que la gran confusión que se está generando es porque hay un número importante de estadounidenses, identificados sobre todo con los sectores liberales.
I think that the great confusion that we see here today is because there is a great number of United States people allied mostly with the liberal part.
Que temen ser señalados como racistas por expresarse abiertamente en contra de que los Estados Unidos se convierta en un país multinacional, que es la pregunta detrás de la petición de estadidad.
They are afraid of speaking up because of fear of racism, of being considered racist. So they are afraid of speaking up against the United States becoming a multinational country.
Which is the fundamental question behind the statehood proposal.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman, lady yields back. Mr. Leap, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I really want to focus today, as many of my colleagues touched base on how we in Congress can fulfill our responsibility to the people of Puerto Rico by providing a free, open, and informed process for resolving their political status. I know here in Michigan, especially in communities of color, we do not take self-government for granted. For years, the state imposed unelected emergency financial managers on a number of majority Black cities across the state of Michigan. We all felt the pain of their unaccountable actions to slash city services and benefits to residents, and in many cases resulted in the poisoning of Flint children with contaminated water. My residents in Detroit still have our municipal bankruptcy fresh in our minds. It's the largest in the history of our country, especially for the pensioners who saw their benefits slashed by someone they didn't vote for or couldn't remove. And it wasn't the people of Detroit who incurred the debt, but it was the people of Detroit who suffered for it. So I understand the pain that Puerto Ricans feel as the unelected, unaccountable financial oversight and management board has slashed budgets and services that taking away Puerto Ricans' basic right to self-government. So Senator Santiago, can you describe for the committee what it's like living under both American colonial rule and by an unelected financial management board, and why the status quo can't continue? And I know you talked about some of it, but talk about really the human impact of all of that.
El régimen colonial que impera en Puerto Rico
The colonial regimen that impairs in Puerto Rico
viola los derechos humanos de todos los puertorriqueños.
Violates the human rights of all Puerto Ricans.
Y con la llegada de la Junta de Control Fiscal,
And with the arrival of the Fiscal Control Junta Board,
con la llegada de la Junta de Control Fiscal, que tiene poder de veto sobre las decisiones de nosotros, los funcionarios electos.
which has veto power over us, elected officials.
No hay otra forma de llamar esto que una dictadura en toda regla.
There's no other way to call this other than a dictatorship.
Nosotros los puertorriqueños reclamamos nuestro derecho colectivo a la libre determinación.
Us Puerto Ricans claim our collective right to free determination.
Y creo que es importante establecer la distinción
And I think it's important to establish a distinction
con otras instancias que han mencionado algunos congresistas.
with other examples that other congressmen have mentioned.
Aquí no se trata de votar si se aprueba un impuesto o no.
We're not here talking about whether to approve a tax or not,
O si vamos a tener algún funcionario electo ejerciendo su cargo por cierto número de años.
or whether we're going to have any official, elected official in their position for a certain number of years.
Aquí se trata del derecho fundamental de una nación colonizada.
Fundamental right of a colonized nation.
Y tenemos como parte de ese derecho
And we have as part of that right
que reclamar la facultad de debatir todas las opciones posibles.
to claim the opportunity to discuss all of the possible options.
En el caso de del proyecto 1522,
In the case of HR 1522,
ignora las profundas diferencias que existen en Puerto Rico.
it ignores the deep differences, the profound differences that we have in Puerto Rico.
Pero además,
Besides,
permite que el Congreso siga rehuyendo su responsabilidad de decirle a los puertorriqueños con todas sus letras qué es lo que están dispuestos a ofrecer.
it also allows Congress to avoid the responsibility, their responsibility to tell the Puerto Ricans what it is that they're willing to offer Puerto Ricans.
Yo estoy convencida, y esa ha sido la experiencia hasta el día de hoy,
I am convinced, and this has been my experience up until today,
que los Estados Unidos,
that the United States,
a la hora de la verdad, no están dispuestos a ofrecerle la estadidad a una nación caribeña y latinoamericana.
when it comes to the truth, to the moment of truth, they're not willing to offer statehood to a Caribbean and Latin American nation.
No, thank you so much, Senator. No, thank you so much. And thank you, Ms. Gomez, for translating. I just want to, I have a very short time, and I just really want my colleagues to truly understand the responsibility that we all have to truly provide a most democratic, participatory, and more informed path forward for Puerto Ricans. And I hope my colleagues will be guided by the goal as we continue to consider the two different bills in front of us right now. And again, really appreciate this really thoughtful conversation that we do always have to be based on the truth about the impact of those that Puerto Ricans and the families that are impacted by our actions. Thank you so much, Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. Now, let me recognize the Chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, Ms. Porter. Time is yours.
Very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to yield my time to Ms. Velasquez.
Lady yields. Ms. Velasquez, you recognize?
Let me thank the gentle lady for yielding. Governor Villar, as a law professor yourself, could you explain how the academics' argument that independent or statehood are the only true self-determination options available under U.S. law is inaccurate? And can you please explain to the members of this committee the current territorial arrangements Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands have?
I will quickly answer, and there was a response from all constitutional law professors from Puerto Rico answering specific that argument and saying that precisely that's why the bill you have proposed is, and that this is my position, is the best alternative, because you have questions, yes, about how free association will work in a relationship with a territory that we are U.S. citizens now. The cases of Micronesia and those other places, they were never U.S. citizens. So in that sense, that's something that the negotiating commission will have to answer. The same thing with any other non-territorial alternative. That's why that's the beauty of your bill, because I hear people and members asking questions to a law professor. Those are the questions that is the Congress that has to answer in terms of the different alternatives and different possibilities. So the people of Puerto Rico then will vote based on that information. We have never had the opportunity to vote with the information of what are the conditions for the different status alternatives, even statehood. Even statehood, there's a lot of things that need to be clarified by Congress before people vote.
Yes, thank you. Well, you know, in the past, proponents of statehood have sold a bill to the people of Puerto Rico saying that they will maintain participation in the U.S. Olympic or Miss Universe, and that will not change if Puerto Rico becomes a state. Things that are so, you know, that might not have incredible implications or economic consequences for the people of Puerto Rico, but it shows to you and it shows us that this is not any election. This is the most important process in our relationship of the United States keeping a colony for 123 years, that it is our responsibility to provide a process for the people to determine their own political future. So a lot of education needs to happen. People need to know, what does it mean supporting or voting for statehood? What does it mean? What is the implication?
Quickly, if I have a second, I heard Governor Pierluisi answering the question about taxes, and that was very illuminating. He said that after we vote for statehood, and on Congressman Darren Soto bill, Puerto Rico will become the 51st state. Then after a vote, they will explain to us what are the consequences, economic consequences and fiscal consequences of our vote. No, that's the things that people need to know before we vote. And that's something that only Congress can answer.
And that is something that my bill does.
Yep.
It includes a transition plan. Mr. Natal, have any of the plebiscites that have been held in recent history, including transition plans for the options put forward, have Puerto Ricans ever received public, non-biased education about the consequences of each of the options?
Unfortunately, they haven't, and they haven't because the plebiscites that have been legislated locally in Puerto Rico have the same default problem, that they have been legislated one-sided by the ruling party, usually trying to design the consultation in a way that it's slanted towards the outcome that it's preferred by the party in power. And that's why it's so important that with your bill, the Legislative Assembly in Puerto Rico would be able to call for a status convention. There are different models that have been suggested. The Puerto Rico's Lawyer Association has presented one for many decades that includes 75 delegates. That's not a small group of people in dark rooms. That's close to the same numbers of members that we have in the Legislative Assembly, but they'll be ordered, they'll be elected specifically according to the status preferences, as long as they're non-colonial, non-territorial. And in that sense, they'll have an equal opportunity to talk to the people of Puerto Rico about why their preferred options is the one that the people should elect. And at the end of the day, the people would have the final decision as it should be.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Porter, for yielding your time to me. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields, Ms. Porter yields back, and let me now recognize Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to the gentlelady from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar, for yielding and always been helping Puerto Rico in many of the issues in the past, and I really appreciate that. I will continue with my line of questioning, and One of the issues that has been brought to this committee is about definitions, and I would love to have Professor Ponsa, which is a constitutionalist professor and who led a letter with more than 45 constitutional professors across the nation from very prestigious universities, including universities in Puerto Rico, to support HR 1522 and establish the unconstitutionality of the other bill. And I will make this question to you. The HR 2070 established a commission of members of Congress will make recommendation to the Status Convention of Puerto Rico, culture and language, under its self-determination options, which we know must include statehood and nationhood. On what aspects of Puerto Rican culture may the Commission make recommendations? Are they in the music, in our religious freedom? It will be in our traditions and history, or it will be in the definitions of how we mix rice and beans, or any other issue. Can you answer that question for me?
Well, as far as I can tell from HR 2070, there is no limit to what those recommendations could be. I don't consider that a good idea. I think that if one is going to respect the people of Puerto Rico, then one should let them live their culture as they do and enjoy it as they will, which I believe is consistent with the constitutional options that are available to it. I am not a fan of having a bilateral commission involving Congress advising Puerto Rico on its culture and language. I do think we've gotten plenty of advice. Thank you very much. What we need is a response to the referendum and that kind of clarity from Congress that it is willing to offer the people of Puerto Rico statehood once they voted for it.
Do you think that bill will be xenophobic?
Which bill?
2017?
I would not describe 2070 as xenophobic, no.
Okay, do you think that it will be a precedent if there are an exclusion of most of the members of this committee of the House that got direct jurisdiction over the issues of the territories and specifically Puerto Rico and the Senate from being able to serve on a congressional committee because that bill would allow a bilateral advice commission to negotiate with the territory of Puerto Rico as we were an independent nation? Do you think that that bill established that Puerto Rico is an independent nation? And if doing so, that means that in order to get free associated states or the status like the Micronesia Island, like some of the witnesses are supporting here, are establishing, should be negotiated without any federal laws applying to Puerto Rico.
So if I've understood your question, I believe that the bilateral commission created by HR 2070 is expected by that bill to negotiate in ways that don't make any sense within the structure of Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. If Puerto Rico is going to debate the options that are available to it, it should be able to debate those without being nudged, guided, advised. Clarity from the federal side is a good thing, but to call it a negotiation when you have the federal government on one side and a territory on the other side that's being steered in its self-determination process, to me, it's a misnomer. That's not a negotiation. That's the federal government guiding a process by advising Puerto Rico on issues in which Puerto Rico should make its own decision instead of offering the kind of clarity that it's Congress's responsibility to provide.
Thank you. And I got 30 seconds in this term. Governor of Puerto Rico, you got a lot of experience in Congress. You were by 8 years a member of this committee in the House. Do you think establishing a constitutional convention or people elected like delegates will be the right option to express to be expressed?
The fact of the matter is that it has never been legislated in Puerto Rico itself. And people here, some were blaming the statehood party. Well, we have not been in control of the House and the Senate and the governorship. always. There have been many occasions in which the House and the Senate of Puerto Rico and the governorship have been controlled by the other major party in Puerto Rico, and this concept of a status convention was never legislated. And the problem I have with it right now is that we just had a vote, a majority vote. We hadn't had a majority vote, a clear-cut majority vote in a long time. In dealing with the status of Puerto Rico. In 2012, we had another one. 54%
Time is up, sir.
clearly rejected the current status, and now 53% approved statehood.
Thank you, Governor.
you.
I yield back.
I yield back.
Keeping track of overtime too. Thank you. Mr. Webster, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to
Thank you,
yield
sir.
I'd like to give my time to the resident delegate from Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Congressman Webster, for yielding and for always being supportive of many of the issues regarding the island. I will continue my line of questions, and I will go now with the governor of Puerto Rico, Mr. Pedro Pelagosi, that, as I said before, was a member of this committee of the House for 8 years, and now is the one representing the island as the elected official to carry out the results of the last election. Governor, there have been many things that have been said today here regarding how Congress is willing or not to grant statehood for Puerto Rico. You were a lawyer as well. You were a former prosecutor and Secretary of Justice locally on the island. You know the movement that gained the right of vote for women and Afro-Americans. Do you think statehood and equality is an issue of civil rights?
Definitely. That's what we're talking about mostly. It has economic development implications, quality of life implications, but at its heart, this is a civil rights issue. Somebody said it before, and I'll repeat it. 9 out of 10 American citizens living in Puerto Rico are proud American citizens. I'm talking about Puerto Ricans. I know a lot of Puerto Ricans unfortunately left the island, and now they're pursuing their dreams in the States. But the ones remaining in Puerto Rico, they're proud American citizens and proud Puerto Ricans, and that's not inconsistent. You can be a proud Puerto Rican American, like you have so many in the States. Puerto Rico will add to this nation. This nation is diverse. And of course, we're Hispanic. This would be the first truly Hispanic state. And of course, we will continue speaking Spanish, but we all aspire to be bilingual. And we will always treasure our heritage, and that's good for America. It's good that we have this history, that we have these customs. That's why people come to Puerto Rico and visit. That's why people come to Puerto Rico and invest in Puerto Rico and retire in Puerto Rico. It's not inconsistent. What we're talking about here is finding a way forward. And the people of Puerto Rico express their will. And the ones here talking about that there was no debate, where are they? Where were they? Were they in the moon? In Mars? We know how to debate these issues. We have been debating them for too long. Everybody in Puerto Rico knows what independence is all about. Everybody in Puerto Rico knows what free association is all about. Everybody in Puerto Rico knows what the current status means. We suffer through it every day. And everybody knows as well what statehood means. Enough of this debate. The ball is in Congress's court. It is time for Congress to address this issue. And I have no doubt if Congress offers statehood to Puerto Rico, you will get an overwhelming vote from the people of Puerto Rico accepting it. That's why I'm not hesitating. That's why our resident commissioner is not hesitating. And you will have a diverse Puerto Rico with Republicans such as Jennifer Gonzalez and Democrats like me. And we will enrich this nation when the time comes and we become the 51st state of the union.
Governor, one of the questions that was made a few minutes ago, and Congressman Case from Hawaii was saying about the percentage and how Hawaii that was voted for statehood and the percentage about that. Do you have an expectation that once there is a bill approved in Congress, like the one we are supporting today, and that becomes a law, that the statehood support will grow on the island once Congress make a formal offer to the island?
I have no doubt some of the ones participating in this hearing, every time, I mean, they don't miss a step saying that Congress will never offer statehood to Puerto Rico. They have been encouraging the people of Puerto Rico to doubt Congress, to doubt this nation. They have been saying, we don't deserve it. They're not going to give it to us. Well, I know the time will come when this offer will be made and the people of Puerto Rico will see that it is for real, and they'll go out and they'll vote overwhelmingly for statehood. I have whatever requirement is imposed on us that is reasonable, we will meet, because we want to become the 51st state.
Thank you, Governor, and now you're back.
Gentlelady yields. Let me now recognize gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Puerto Ricans on the island are citizens of the United States, and we are here today to debate whether those citizens should be equal. And the mere fact that we are even debating the legal equality of Puerto Ricans as American citizens is a tragedy for both democracy and decolonization. And history will not judge us kindly for the grave harm that we have done and continue to do to the people of Puerto Rico. If Puerto Ricans are American citizens, why not make them equal under the law? If Puerto Ricans have long been and largely wish to remain citizens, which has been borne out repeatedly, there are only two options that preserve citizenship. There is the status quo, which means colonialism, and then there's statehood, which means legal equality. The single most egregious example of colonialism is the Financial Control Board, which represents a cardinal sin against the sovereignty and self-determination of Puerto Rico. The fact is, if Puerto Rico were a state, there would be no Financial Control Board. Unlike colonies, states have rights under the United States Constitution. The absence of statehood has left Puerto Rico wide open to colonization at the hands of the Financial Control Board. The United States Congress that gave us the Financial Control Board is the same Congress that now wishes to deny Puerto Rico the right to exercise self-determination through a plebiscite. Now, I imagine there are powerful interests that have a stake in the status quo of colonialism. But if you're a corporation that exploits Puerto Rico as a tax haven, you have a powerful incentive to sabotage statehood. But if you're an everyday Puerto Rican who seeks to become an equal citizen of the United States, who seeks to have the right to vote in presidential and congressional elections, who seeks to have your voice heard, to have a seat at the table, and to get your fair share of federal resources and representation, then you have every reason to support statehood. And that is precisely what a majority of the Puerto Rican electorate voted to do in November of 2020. And instead of respecting the will of the people, the United States Congress has chosen to ignore it. And not only has Congress chosen to ignore the results of the plebiscite, members of Congress are proposing to micromanage the process by which Puerto Ricans make decisions about their own status. The patronizing paternalism of Congress should never be mistaken for self-determination. True self-determination means that the people on the island have a right to decide not only what to decide, but how to decide. Congress should practice the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm. When the people speak, the proper role of Congress is to listen. The people of Puerto Rico have spoken through a democratic process. Congress ought to listen to the people. Congress ought to legislate what the people voted for. And Congress ought to abolish the Financial Control Board, which is an abomination. That, to me, is true decolonization. Everything else is a red herring, a distraction masquerading as decolonization. I have a question for the governor. I've never met the governor. It's good to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Would likely yield 2 U.S. senators and 5 members of Congress. Regardless of where one stands on the question of status, we all have a vested interest in securing more resources for Puerto Rico. Is it fair to say that 2 U.S. senators and 5 members of Congress would likely mean more resources for Puerto Rico, which is an outcome that all of us share?
But of course, they would be our gladiators. They would be fighting for us whenever we face a natural disaster, whenever the nation as a whole is facing a pandemic like the one we are dealing with at the moment. We have no voice, no vote in the Senate. We have friends, colleagues in the Senate that come to assist us, but it is not the same. And we only have a great resident commissioner, but only one without a vote in the House. We would have at least 4, perhaps 5. You don't need to know much about politics to realize that that would make a big difference. And voting for the president. Presidents don't visit Puerto Rico, rarely so. Why? They don't need our vote. I have no doubt presidents would be visiting, candidates for president would be visiting to make commitments to the American citizens of Puerto Rico when they're aspiring to the highest office in this nation. That makes a difference. That's going to make a difference. That would be democratic. Our status is not democratic.
Time is up. Gentleman yields back. Let me now recognize Representative Pedro from New Mexico. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield my time to Representative Gonzalez Colon.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Harold, for yielding, and appreciate you being in the hearing the whole afternoon. Really, that means a lot for the people of Puerto Rico, knowing that members of Congress, even when there's votes being called, are participating in this hearing. That is an answer for the November election. So I want to say thank you. I want to make questions to Professor Ponza, and this is not that I'm fixated with your statement, is that you are the constitutionalist here, the professor, who can clarify many of the words that are being put in some bills trying to be constitutional. And you just said many times today that no. I know that in the past you have argued that statehood is not just about equality, that it's also about empowerment. Could you elaborate on this idea and how saying here in Congress, having leverage, and I do know about that because I cannot vote on the floor. I mean, I can vote on amendments, but not on the floor on regular bills. And we got that situation during the last 4 years. How do you think Puerto Rico can achieve a more economic process by having statehood?
Well, I frankly can't put it better than you and the governor have, but I can add this. It isn't only that Puerto Rico would have 2 senators and 4 or 5 representatives and the presidential vote. It's also that statehood itself as a status would guarantee equality in legislation that the federal government passes to aid and address issues in the states. As a territory, Puerto Rico is subject either to exclusion from certain programs, such as SSI, or to caps in benefit programs. So there's no comparison between the current situation in which Puerto Rico has no voting representation whatsoever in the federal government. It has you, thank goodness, but it does not have voting representation in the federal government, and a situation in which it is empowered based proportionately to its population, like any other jurisdiction under the United States, with equality in the vote. So that difference is profound, and it is also a constitutionally protected difference because states are treated equivalently under the Constitution. So it's both the presence of voting representatives and the status of statehood that would guarantee equality for Puerto Ricans.
You just said, well, and I've been fighting for the inclusion of Puerto Rico in many federal programs as Governor Pierluisi did while he was in Congress. However, some people talk about parity without statehood, and that means it's leaving Puerto Rico at the mercy of the decisions in Congress, not having their elected officials to take part in that decision process. And as a territory, we always run the risk that the next Congress or the next administration can simply decide whether or not we will be treated equally or not. Even President Bush established an executive order that Puerto Rico should be treated equally in all federal programs as a state. But yet, administration change, and that executive order is being interpreted in many different ways. My question will be to you, what options of status will guarantee the U.S. citizenship for Puerto Rico?
So specifically as to the question of citizenship, only statehood guarantees citizenship for current U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico and going forward. Under the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, then birthright citizenship will exist in Puerto Rico now and going forward. Other options, the United States has the power to grant citizenship anywhere in the world that it wants. So advocates of free association argue that free association should come with U.S. citizenship. The truth is that I understand the difference that Governor Acevedo Vilá pointed to, that the other free associated states with relations to the United States weren't citizens beforehand, but it's really important to understand the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas had a choice to become a free associated state or to enter into a different kind of arrangement with the U.S., which ended up being territorial, and they made that choice in order to preserve citizenship. The United States could have granted that citizenship, but it didn't want to a free associated state, and even if it did, and this is what the people have to understand when they consider the options, the United States could always stop granting birthright citizenship going forward in a free associated state. So even if it was preserved for some time, it could always be taken away. Only statehood guarantees it now and going forward.
Thank you, Professor. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Graves, you're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes. Graves? Let me ask the ranking member, is Mr. Graves available, or we were notified by the...
I'm sorry, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
sir.
Yeah, I'm here.
You're recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I've been in and out of the hearing today and trying to listen as much as I can. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I got a couple of questions. One, I heard one of the previous members talking about this treating Puerto Rico as a colony and disrespecting the citizens. Look, I want to remind everybody here today that in the aftermath of the just awful hurricanes that the island experienced, that we provided billions and billions of dollars for the island for restoration and disaster recovery efforts that Congresswoman Colon Gonzalez fought for, to make sure that that the citizens of Puerto Rico would be treated properly. And let's be clear that these dollars were well beyond the capability of the Puerto Rican government, and we were there, and no one was disrespected. In fact, if you were to go through and do an analysis at the cost per capita, it's probably one of the highest allocations in history in terms of dollars per person that was provided, and that's a direct result of Puerto Rico's delegates' hard efforts up in the Congress. Governor, it's nice to see you again. I hope you're doing well. I want to ask you a very quick question because I've got some other ones. Can you just briefly respond? How will the Puerto Rican citizens respond to federal taxation that they would be open to? And just being the governor, kind of maybe just briefly explain, you have control over that now. You have the ability to tax at whatever rate you want effectively. And if now the federal government's going to come in and tax as well, is that a benefit? How will the citizens respond? Could you just briefly respond to that?
Yeah, because of our income levels, a considerable number of our residents wouldn't pay federal income taxes. Actually, in the mainland, about 46% of the population do not pay federal income taxes. So in Puerto Rico, it would be higher than that. At the corporate level, we would have to transition. we would have to transition this issue, and obviously Congress would have to step in the way. It makes no sense to admit a territory into the union and to affect the territory. You would be assisting the territory in joining the union. As an incorporated territory, we do not pay federal income taxes on income we earn in Puerto Rico. We pay payroll taxes, and so. And a lot of the American corporations doing in Puerto Rico actually pay federal income taxes because they operate through divisions in Puerto Rico. On the manufacturing side, they're basically treated as foreign. And they are treated like investing in Puerto Rico is like investing in Ireland or in Singapore. That's an area in which we would have to transition. But the tax uniformity clause of the U.S. Constitution shouldn't be viewed as static. It would allow, in a circumstance like Puerto Rico is facing, for a transition. And that's what I envision happening here.
Thank you, Governor. I appreciate that answer. I also was trying to listen, and I hope that I caught all this accurately, but Governor Ciro Vila, you campaigned against statehood, and you had run an election and didn't win that election, but and I want to understand it seems
Congressman,
as though
sorry, can you repeat, because I lost the audio for a minute.
Oh, yikes.
No, now I'm hearing you, but I lost you in the middle of a question.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay.
I'm sorry about that. I was saying that that you campaigned against statehood and didn't win on that platform. And I'm trying to understand the official representative of the Popular Democrat Party. As I understand, Jose Dalmu is actually on record against HR 2070, yet I think you may be advocating differently, and I'm just trying to understand kind of the political dynamics there.
No, the Popular Democratic Party is against 1522. In terms of 2070, I'm not here on behalf of the Popular Democratic Party, so I guess at some time he was going to be invited. But I just want to make a clarification. Yes, I ran in the last election. I lost the election. I have heard here a lot of people saying that statehood got more votes than any of the elected officials. But you know what? The vote against statehood, the no vote, got more votes than any of the elected officials. People voted more against statehood than they voted for Resident Commissioner Gonzalez and Governor Pierluisi. That only shows that we are divided, on this issue, and that process of November 2020 was not really a balanced and fair process.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I know I'm over time, but I cut out. I just want to make for the record, it was my understanding that the new chairman of the Popular Democrat Party, Jose Dalmu, was actually on record against HR 2070. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grave. Gentleman yields. No one else to be recognized. I will take my opportunity now to ask a couple of quick questions, and then in some of the overtime, let me indulge the members with a couple of points. First of all, in terms of, it was brought up once, and then it was brought up in the communication from Ms. Gonzalez Colon and from the ranking member, Mr. Westerman, about doing in-person meetings insofar as those become important, and that's the way to go, and that we could be much more productive, and et cetera. Well, I don't disagree. The first thing I would love to do is to have in-person meetings so that these discussions could occur. The issue is for all the members to know, in spite of the deployment of vaccines, COVID cases continue to rise. In some parts of the country, cases are surging. In the last 7 days, CDC has reported over 450,000 new COVID cases. And the Office of the Attending Physician continues to adamantly recommend that we maximize the utilization of remote work. We don't know the vaccine status of all members and staff, and that's another reason. And so as this horrific situation that we all find ourselves in, not just Congress, then we'll begin to accelerate and put in the protocols necessary to have more in-person meetings. I'm not enjoying the processes we have now, but this is the process we have. And the issue of Puerto Rico and status was something that there was criticism that we were delaying this and that it wasn't getting done. Well, it was getting done. And so we had to have, the reason we did it, and we did it remotely, is that that we needed to expedite this and have this discussion and begin the deliberations that I think are critical to dealing with this question. The other part that's critical in dealing with this question, my friends, is that there's a division, not only a division in Puerto Rico in terms of opinion about statehood or another status, but also a difference of opinion within Congress, and a difference of opinion in the U.S. Senate, a difference of opinion in the House of Representatives. And so going forward, these kinds of discussions and deliberations are critical. Like it or not, it is, and sometimes I like it less, is Congress has a critical role in this decision and how it's going to be made. And I recognize the difficulty for some members, but I also recognize that it's going to come a point where we're going to have to move forward on it. And I find it interesting that if, let's say hypothetically, whichever one of these bills the House passed, that there could be a significant difference of opinion in the U.S. Senate. We've been communicating with the Biden White House through their Insular affairs and the domestic council and other leadership in the White House, and asking for the Justice Department to issue an opinion on both pieces of legislation. And those will be forthcoming. And some of the constitutional issues that were brought up by the professor are part of the log of questions that we asked, including the binding nature in terms of us moving forward in terms of the vote that happened in November in terms of pro-statehood by the percentage that Mr. Case pointed out. Nevertheless, that's where we're at, and that information will be shared with everybody. I have two quick questions. Mr. Natal, let me ask you a question. As we were going through this discussion, I heard a couple of things today, and many of the other questions I would have asked that were on my list, other members took care of that. HR 2070, the public process, the stakeholder involvement, the community process, community-based process. In support of that process, but we heard today from primarily other panelists and some of my colleagues up here on the dais that if you support this process, you're not acknowledging the clear-cut decision that was made in November in that election, that it is an excuse to delay and for Congress to be, I think the governor put it that, not to be courageous and make a decision, and that there's unconstitutionalities associated with one, and that there is that a definitive answer has been made. So my question to you, which is the question that was directly and indirectly posed for most of this hearing, is why not just let it have an up or down referendum on the question and go forward from there? Why is this process of public engagement so critical? And let me leave it to you for whatever answer. Then I have one more question. I'm done.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Grijalva. Well, the quick answer is this is not the first time that a referendum like this has taken place. Just to give you an idea, in the last 16 years, 10 different bills have been presented regarding the statehood issue in the United States. We have had at least 3 referendums, and regardless whether the statehood supposedly got 97% or 50.5%, a process that's born out of the lack of participation, out of exclusion, out of the imposition by one of the political parties is a process which outcome lacks democratic legitimacy. And that's why it doesn't matter if statehood got 97 3 years ago or it got 51 this time around. It's a process that was born out of the exclusion. And that's why it's so necessary that this Congress allows the people of Puerto Rico to put forward a participative, inclusive process of all non-colonial options. And I would just use this analogy, Chairman. Most individuals, and I respect that, of members of this committee have yielded their time either to Congresswoman Velasquez or Congresswoman Gonzalez because they understand that as Puerto Ricans, they know more about this than maybe they do. Well, that's what they should do with this vote and support HR 2070, yield the decision to the people of Puerto Rico and let Puerto Ricans decide.
The other question, and if I may, Mr. Fuentes, given your extensive experience, the work that you've done in Puerto Rico, the work that you did with the previous administration on issues related to Puerto Rico, the hypothetical I asked earlier in my comments, the last time around, the last 4 years, there was nothing definitive coming from the previous administration. We hope to get opinion soon. And there was no movement at all in the Senate with the previous leadership at that point. In fact, part of the Senate leadership at that point said that over my dead body are we going to deal with this question of statehood or status for Puerto Rico. Do you see and then you have, like I said, the differences of opinion both in the House and in the Senate. How do you respond to the fact that we need to come to some closure, and how do we do that, given the dynamics, given the history, and given the fact that this issue is not an issue that can readily be dealt with in one vote, that it's going to require, I think, some level of deliberation and consensus, but that's going to, I leave that question to you. How do you see the progress going forward?
Well, Chairman Grijalva, thank you very much for this hearing, which is very important. The way I see it, politics are playing a role in this process that is really unacceptable. As we've discussed previously, political forecasting is even worse than weather forecasting. But as we see Puerto Ricans leaving the island and moving to the mainland to get better quality of life, what we now have is 3 million Puerto Ricans living on the island, 6 million living in the mainland in one of the 50 states. So that starts to create political power. And as that political power starts to be recognized, I believe that other voices are going to start understanding it and changing. And I would point out at Senator Scott and Senator Rubio in the U.S. Senate, both of whom recognize the importance of the Puerto Rican vote in Central Florida, and both of whom have expressed themselves in favor of statehood, but need to create the basis for them to launch the effort in the Senate. It will happen.
So it still comes down to regardless, of the discussions about what the Senate or the House can do. I think that Congress can pass legislation, whether it is 1522 or 2070, and that becomes the law. And we can project and talk about estimating what the constitutionality or non-constitutionality of it is. But once a decision is made by this body and the other body, I think that question then becomes moot. But I want to thank all of the witnesses. I appreciate it. There's written questions that members did not get to that will be forwarded to you. I appreciate it. Governor, thank you. Mr. Rivas, thank you. And the meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.